Welcome back to Haunted Fears. The Appalachian deep woods have a reputation, one whispered about in small mountain towns and around dying campfires. These ancient forests hold secrets that most people will never understand, and the ones who do rarely speak about them. Tonight, I'm sharing 11 encounters from people who ventured too deep, stayed too long, or simply found themselves in the wrong place when the woods decided to reveal what they've been hiding. These aren't legends passed down through generations. These are recent experiences, disturbing moments that happen to ordinary people just like you. Some of them are still trying to make sense of what they witnessed. Others have simply accepted that there are things in those mountains that defy explanation. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join the Haunted Fears horror family because we post chilling content like this every week. And if you're already part of the family, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. What would you do if you heard a dead loved one's voice calling you deeper into the woods? That's exactly what happened to me in October of 2023, and I still can't explain it. I've been hiking the Smokies for nearly 15 years, ever since I moved to Tennessee for work. I know these mountains like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. Panther Creek Trail isn't one of the popular routes. Most tourists stick to Laurel Falls or Alum Cave, the trails with paved parking lots and crowds of people snapping selfies. Panther Creek is different. It's steep, rocky, and requires crossing the creek 10 times on your way down. The kind of trail where you might not see another person all day. That's exactly why I loved it. I set out early that morning, around 7. The October air was crisp, and fog hung low in the hollows, giving everything this dreamlike quality. I'd taken the Jakes Creek Trail up from Elkmont, planning to loop back down through Panther Creek and Middle Prong. It was a 17-mile loop I'd done at least a dozen times before. The leaves were peak season, brilliant reds and oranges, and the morning sun filtering through the canopy created these golden shafts of light that photographers would kill for. Everything was normal for the first few hours. I passed the junction where Jakes Creek meets Panther Creek around 10:30, stopped to refill my water bottle, and ate a granola bar while sitting on a moss-covered log. The sound of the creek was constant, that white noise that makes you feel both alone and somehow connected to everything around you. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how this was exactly what I needed after the week I'd had at work. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but as I stood there, frozen with my water bottle halfway to my mouth, I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was singing. A woman's voice, clear and strong, carrying through the forest from somewhere deeper in the hollow. And not just any voice. It was singing Amazing Grace in the exact way my grandmother Selena used to sing it. My grandmother had been dead for 6 years. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. Stress, lack of sleep, maybe some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by solitude. I thought all those things too, in that first moment. But this wasn't some vague impression or wishful thinking. This was her voice, distinctive and unmistakable. Selena had this particular way of drawing out certain notes, especially on the word grace, letting her voice rise and fall in a pattern I'd heard hundreds of times growing up in her small church in eastern Kentucky. The singing was coming from off-trail, deeper into the hollow where the rhododendrons grew thick and the forest floor dropped away sharply toward the creek bed. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stay on the trail, to keep moving, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't, because as impossible as it was, that was my grandmother's voice, and it was calling me. I left my backpack on the trail, marked the spot with a pile of rocks so I could find my way back, and started making my way through the undergrowth. The rhododendrons were dense, their branches twisted and gnarled, forcing me to duck and weave through gaps barely wide enough for my shoulders. The singing continued, never getting louder or softer, always seeming to be just ahead, just out of reach. The forest changed the deeper I went. The light took on a different quality, filtered through layers of fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The sounds changed too. The constant rush of Panther Creek faded to a distant whisper, and the normal bird calls and rustling of small animals disappeared completely. There was just the singing, and my own breathing, and the sound of my boots crushing dead leaves. I don't know how long I walked like that. It could have been 20 minutes or an hour. Time felt strange, elastic, like I was moving through something thicker than air. My legs kept moving forward even as my mind kept screaming at me to turn around, to run, to do anything but keep following that impossible voice into the depths of the hollow. Then, suddenly, the rhododendrons opened up, and I found myself standing in a small clearing. And in the middle of that clearing were the ruins of an old homestead. It wasn't much, just the stone foundation of what had probably been a single-room cabin, maybe 12 by 15 feet, with a crumbling chimney on one end. The logs that had once formed the walls were long gone, probably rotted away or carried off by scavengers decades ago. But the stones of the foundation remained, covered in moss and lichen, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. A few feet away was what looked like the remains of a root cellar. Its wooden door collapsed inward, revealing a dark hole in the ground. And the singing stopped. The silence was absolute. Not the peaceful quiet of the forest, but something else. Something wrong. Like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I stood there at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These old homesteads aren't uncommon in the Smokies. Before the park was established in the 1930s, thousands of people lived in these mountains. Most of them were forced out when the government bought up the land, leaving behind their homes and farms and entire communities. The forest has been slowly swallowing the evidence of their existence ever since. But this homestead shouldn't have been here. I knew this section of the park well. I'd studied the maps, read the historical accounts, talked to rangers who'd worked here for decades. There was no record of any settlement in this particular hollow. Nothing. And yet, here it was, impossible to deny, its stones solid and real under the carpet of fallen leaves. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were everywhere, circling the foundation in a pattern that made no sense. Fresh footprints, pressed into the soft earth where the leaves had been disturbed. And they were my footprints. I recognized the distinctive tread pattern of my hiking boots, Merrill Moabs, worn down in specific places from hundreds of miles of trail. But I hadn't walked around the foundation. I was still standing at the edge of the clearing where I'd emerged from the rhododendrons. I felt my skin go cold. My breath came in short, rapid gasps. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only stand there, staring at those impossible footprints, trying to understand what I was seeing. The pattern wasn't random. The footprints circled the foundation exactly 3 times, always staying the same distance from the stones, like someone, like I, had been pacing around it in some kind of ritual. And at various points in the circle, the prints would stop, turn to face the foundation, then turn back and continue walking. Like someone stopping to look at something, to study it from different angles. But it was the final set of prints that made me feel like I was going to be sick. They led from the circle directly to where I was standing now at the edge of the clearing. They approached from inside the circle, heading toward my exact position, and they stopped right in front of me, right where my boots were planted in the soft earth. It looked like I had walked up to myself, like I had stepped into my own footprints, which should have been impossible because I was already standing in them. I don't remember making the decision to leave. My body just moved, turning away from the clearing, pushing back through the rhododendrons with a desperation that bordered on panic. Branches scraped my face and arms. My jacket caught and tore on a twisted branch, but I didn't slow down. I had to get out of that hollow, away from those impossible footprints, away from the silence that felt like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I burst back onto the trail, gasping for air, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick up my backpack. The pile of rocks I'd left to mark my detour was still there, exactly as I'd arranged it. My water bottle was still sitting on the log where I'd left it. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be. Except when I checked my watch, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. I'd been gone for over 5 hours. The hike from that junction to where I'd heard the singing should have taken 15 minutes, maybe 20 with the off-trail detour. But somehow, 5 hours had passed. I didn't stop to rest or think it through. I just started hiking, pushing hard despite my exhaustion, desperate to get back to the trailhead before dark. My mind was racing, trying to construct some logical explanation for what had happened. Maybe I'd gotten disoriented in the rhododendrons. Maybe I'd been walking in circles for hours without realizing it. Maybe there was some kind of gas seeping up from the ground in that hollow, something that had caused hallucinations or confusion. But none of those explanations could account for the footprints. My footprints, circling that foundation 3 times before leading back to exactly where I was standing. I made it back to my truck just as the sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the parking lot at Elkmont. There were only 2 other vehicles left, both of them empty. I sat in my truck for a long time, hands still shaking, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to call someone, to tell them what I'd experienced. But what would I say? That I'd followed my dead grandmother's voice into the woods and found my own footprints waiting for me. Instead, I drove home, took a hot shower, and tried to convince myself that it had been some kind of stress-induced episode. I almost succeeded, until I was getting undressed for bed and found something in my jacket pocket that hadn't been there before. It was a small piece of stone, roughly rectangular, worn smooth by age and handling. When I looked closer, I could see faint marks carved into its surface, letters or maybe numbers, so weathered they were almost impossible to read, but I could make out enough to recognize what it was, a fragment of a grave marker, and scratched into the back, in letters that looked much newer than the marks on the front, was a single word: Selena. I still have that stone. It sits in a drawer in my desk, and I haven't been back to Panther Creek since that day. I've thought about going back, about trying to find that clearing again, to prove to myself that it was real, or to prove that it wasn't. But I can't make myself do it, because sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I hear singing. Faint, distant, like it's coming from somewhere far away. And it's always Amazing Grace, sung in my grandmother's voice, with that particular way she had of drawing out the word grace. And every time I hear it, I wonder, was I following her voice that day, or was she following mine? If you've had a similar experience in the Appalachian Mountains, drop a comment below. I need to know I'm not the only one who's encountered something like this in these ancient hills. And if you're thinking about exploring off-trail in the Smokies, please stay on the marked paths. Some voices in these woods aren't meant to be followed. Have you ever seen yourself hiking ahead of you on an empty trail? I have, and it's the reason I don't backpack alone anymore. My name is Stefan, and I'm a wildlife photographer based out of Charleston. I've spent the better part of a decade documenting backcountry areas across the eastern United States, and West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest had been on my list for years. In September of 2024, I finally carved out 3 days to do a solo trip through the Dolly Sods Wilderness area, one of the most remote sections of the forest. The plan was straightforward. I'd start at the Red Creek trailhead, hike up to the plateau, camp 2 nights in the backcountry, and loop back out through Lion's Head. About 28 miles total, all of it through terrain that ranges from dense spruce forest to open, wind-swept heath barrens that look more like the Scottish Highlands than West Virginia. It's the kind of landscape that draws photographers like me, dramatic, moody, and isolated enough that you can go days without seeing another person. I should have paid more attention to that last part. The first day went exactly as planned. I made good time up the Red Creek Trail, stopped to photograph a family of black bears foraging near the water, and reached my planned camping spot on the plateau by late afternoon. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperature in the low 60s, just enough wind to keep the bugs down. I set up my tent in a stand of stunted red spruce, cooked a freeze-dried meal, and watched the sunset turn the heath barrens every shade of orange and purple imaginable. I didn't see another person all day. In backcountry terms, that's not unusual. Dolly Sods gets its share of visitors, but spread them across 50,000 acres of wilderness, and you can easily go your entire trip without crossing paths with anyone. It's one of the reasons I loved places like this. Just me, my camera, and the landscape. That night, I slept like a rock. No strange sounds, no weird dreams. Nothing to suggest that the next day would be anything other than another perfect day of hiking and photography. I woke up at dawn, made coffee on my camp stove, and broke camp by 7. The morning light was incredible. Low-angle sun cutting through patches of fog, creating these ethereal scenes that had me stopping every 100 yards to set up my tripod. By 9 o'clock, I'd already filled a memory card with shots that I knew would be some of my best work. That's when I first saw him. I was on the Dobbin Grade Trail, a long stretch that runs along the edge of the plateau with views down into the Red Creek Gorge. The trail here is relatively straight for maybe half a mile, with good visibility. I just finished photographing a particularly photogenic section of wind-twisted spruce when I noticed movement ahead of me. Another hiker, maybe 300 yards up the trail. My first reaction was disappointment. I know that sounds selfish, but when you've had an entire wilderness area to yourself for 24 hours, seeing another person feels like an intrusion. But I shrugged it off. There was plenty of room for both of us, and I'd probably pass him, or he'd pass me at some point during the day. Except as I got closer, something felt off. The hiker was wearing a jacket that looked exactly like mine, a blue Arc'teryx shell that I'd saved up for months to buy. Same color, same cut, same distinctive logo on the shoulder. And he was carrying what looked like the same backpack I had on. A 60-liter Osprey in burnt orange, a color they'd only made for one season. I'd never seen another one in the wild. Coincidence, I told myself. Lots of people have similar gear, but the feeling of unease was growing. I picked up my pace, thinking I'd catch up and maybe exchange a few words, compare notes on campsites or trail conditions. But every time I felt like I was gaining on him, he seemed to stay the same distance ahead. Not walking faster, not looking back, just maintaining that constant 300-yard gap. After about 20 minutes of this, I stopped and called out, "Hey, hold up a second." The figure ahead didn't stop, didn't turn around, didn't give any indication that he'd heard me. He just kept walking at that same steady pace, disappearing around a bend in the trail. When I reached the bend myself, maybe 30 seconds later, the trail ahead was empty. Just gone. And this wasn't a section with a lot of turnoffs or side trails. It was just the main trail, with dense vegetation on both sides. There was nowhere for him to have gone that quickly. I stood there for a full minute scanning the forest on either side of the trail, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the wind moving through the spruce trees and the distant sound of Red Creek far below. I convinced myself I'd been seeing things. Combination of early morning light, fog, and maybe a deer or bear that I'd mistaken for a person at a distance. The mind plays tricks in the backcountry, especially when you're alone. I'd experienced it before. Shadows that looked like animals, wind sounds that seemed like voices. This was just another one of those moments. Except it happened again 2 hours later. I'd stopped for lunch at an overlook, sitting on a flat rock, eating a sandwich, and reviewing the photos on my camera. When I looked up, there he was again. Same hiker, same blue jacket, same burnt orange backpack, about the same distance ahead on the trail. This time I could see him more clearly. He was about my height, my build, moving with a gait that seemed somehow familiar. That's when the first real spike of fear hit me, because I realized what had been bothering me about his movement. He walked exactly like I did. That slight favor of the left leg from an old knee injury. The particular way I shifted my weight when I had a heavy pack on. The way I'd occasionally roll my shoulders to adjust the pack straps. I grabbed my camera and zoomed in with my telephoto lens. Through the viewfinder, I could see him more clearly now. The jacket was exactly like mine, down to the small tear on the left sleeve that I'd gotten 3 months ago, snagging it on a branch. The backpack had the same pattern of straps and clips, the same repair patch on the bottom where I'd burned a hole sitting too close to a campfire last year. And hanging from one of the backpack straps was my camera's rain cover, the distinctive yellow one that I'd bought as an afterthought and never saw anyone else using. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the camera. I lowered it slowly, and that's when he turned his head. Just slightly. Not enough for me to see his face, but enough that I saw the same baseball cap I was wearing. The same Portland Trail Blazers cap my sister Kira had given me for my birthday, with the same coffee stain on the brim. He turned back and kept walking, and I watched him until he disappeared around another bend. I don't know how long I sat on that rock. Could have been 5 minutes. Could have been an hour. My brain was trying to process what I'd seen, trying to construct some rational explanation. Elaborate prank. But who would do that? And how would they know what gear I was carrying? Hallucination? But it had been so clear, so detailed. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, to bail on the trip and hike back the way I'd come. But that would have meant an additional 15 miles of backtracking, and I'd be hiking in the dark. The smart move, the safe move, was to continue on the planned route. Only 10 more miles to the exit, and I could do that before nightfall if I pushed hard. So I kept hiking. For the rest of the afternoon, I didn't see him again, but I felt watched. That constant prickling sensation on the back of your neck that tells you someone's eyes are on you. I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning the trail ahead, jumping at every sound in the forest. By 5 o'clock, I was exhausted. Not from the physical exertion, but from the constant vigilance, the adrenaline that had been pumping through my system for hours. I'd reached my planned campsite for the second night, a small clearing near a spring that I'd marked on my map. The sun was starting to drop toward the horizon, and I knew I needed to set up camp before I lost the light. That's when I saw the tent. It was set up in the exact spot where I'd planned to camp. Same model as mine, a big Agnes copper spur, which isn't exactly rare but isn't super common either. Same color, same configuration, positioned in exactly the same way I would have set it up, opening facing east to catch the morning sun, guy lines secured to the same trees I would have chosen, my tent, but I was still carrying mine on my back. I approached slowly, my heart hammering. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone here?" No response. The tent was completely still, no movement inside, no sounds. I crept closer and noticed more details. A camp stove set up outside the tent, the same MSR pocket rocket model I used. A stuff sack hanging from a tree branch with my same food bag. Even a pair of boots sitting outside the tent entrance. Salomon trail runners, size 11, with the same wear pattern as mine. My hands were trembling as I reached for the tent zipper. Part of me knew I shouldn't look, that whatever was inside would be something I couldn't unsee. But I had to know. The zipper was already halfway open. I pulled it down the rest of the way and looked inside. My sleeping bag was laid out, perfectly arranged, exactly as I would have done it. My sleeping pad was inflated. My headlamp was hanging from the tent's interior loop. My journal was lying open on top of the sleeping bag. I picked up the journal with shaking hands and looked at the open page. It was my handwriting, but I hadn't written these words. The entry was dated today, September 17th, 2024, and it described my entire day, the morning light, the photos I'd taken, the lunch at the Overlook, everything exactly as it had happened. And then one final line. "He's here now. He finally found the camp." I dropped the journal like it had burned me and stumbled backward out of the tent. My vision was tunneling, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, and there he was, standing maybe 20 feet away, next to a large spruce tree. Same jacket, same pack, same hat. And this time, I could see his face. It was my face. Not similar, not close. Exactly my face. Same 3-day stubble, same scar over my left eyebrow from a childhood accident, same crooked nose from a skateboarding injury in high school. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, not threatening, not friendly, just observing. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at each other. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in this impossible moment with my impossible double. Then he smiled. It wasn't a nice smile, and he pointed behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every cell in my body was screaming at me not to take my eyes off him. But something, curiosity, terror, the same impulse that makes you look at a car accident, made me glance over my shoulder. The tent was gone. The camp stove, the food bag, the boots, all of it had vanished. The clearing was empty except for my backpack, which I'd dropped when I'd first seen the tent. When I turned back around, he was gone too. Just gone, like he'd never been there at all. I didn't set up camp that night. I grabbed my pack and started hiking, using my headlamp to navigate the trail in the dark. It was stupid, dangerous, everything you're not supposed to do in the backcountry. But I couldn't stay in that clearing. I couldn't risk falling asleep and finding out what would happen if I did. I hiked through the night, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to sit down for a few minutes before pushing on. By the time dawn broke, I was only a few miles from the trailhead. I practically ran the last section, and when I finally reached my truck in the parking lot, I broke down completely. I sat in my truck for 2 hours, crying and shaking, before I could pull myself together enough to drive. Here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. When I got home and went through my camera, there were photos I didn't remember taking. Lots of them. Shots of the trail from angles I'd never been, images of campsites I'd never made, selfies of me in locations I'd never visited. All from that trip. All time-stamped during the 3 days I was in Dolly Sods, and in one photo, taken at what looks like the clearing where I saw the tent, I'm standing there, setting up camp. But I'm in the background of the shot. Someone else, someone who looks exactly like me, is holding the camera. I haven't been back to Monongahela. I don't think I ever will. And I sold all my backpacking gear the week after I got back. Now, when I do photography trips, I go with groups, lots of people, because I learned something in those woods that I wish I hadn't. Sometimes, in places remote enough, empty enough, you might run into yourself, and that version of you has been out there longer, knows the woods better, and has been waiting for you to arrive. If you're planning a solo trip into remote wilderness, please reconsider. And if you see yourself on the trail ahead of you, do not follow. Turn around and get out as fast as you can, because once you catch up to yourself, you might find out which one of you is real. Imagine something huge stalking you through vegetation so thick you can't see 3 feet ahead. That's what happened to me in the Virginia Highlands, and I've never felt so helpless in my life. My name is Paloma, and I work as a wildlife biologist for the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. My specialty is tracking black bear populations in the Appalachian region, which means I spend a lot of time bushwhacking through remote areas where most people never go. I'm comfortable in the backcountry, or at least I thought I was before, that day in May 2024. I was conducting a solo survey in the Laurel Fork area of the George Washington National Forest, near the Virginia-West Virginia border. This is rugged country, sitting at around 4,000 feet elevation, with a unique ecosystem that includes old-growth forest and dense rhododendron thickets that locals call Laurel Hells. The name is apt. These thickets can be almost impenetrable, with branches so twisted and intertwined that you sometimes have to crawl on your hands and knees to get through them. I'd been tracking a tagged bear, A large male we designated Bear 47, using telemetry equipment. His signal was coming from deep in one of these rhododendron thickets, about a mile off any established trail. This wasn't unusual. Bears love these dense areas because they provide cover and cooler temperatures during the day. What was unusual was that his signal hadn't moved in over 36 hours. Bears don't stay in one spot that long unless they're dead, injured, or protecting a kill. Given that it was May, past hibernation season but before the really hot weather, I was concerned he might be injured or sick. My job was to locate him and assess his condition. I entered the rhododendron thicket around 10 a.m. The change was immediate and dramatic. One moment I was walking through relatively open hardwood forest with good visibility. The next, I was pushing through a wall of evergreen branches, the canopy closing over my head like a tunnel. The rhododendron stems were thick as my wrist in places, growing so densely that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The light took on a green-filtered quality, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I had my GPS, my telemetry receiver, and my field pack with basic supplies. The receiver was pinging steadily, indicating Bear 47 was about 200 yards ahead. I started pushing through the thicket, ducking under low branches, squeezing between stems, occasionally having to backtrack and find a different route when the growth became completely impassable. It was slow, exhausting work. After about 15 minutes, I'd covered maybe 50 yards. Sweat was running down my face despite the cool air under the canopy. I stopped to check my bearings and take a drink of water. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping. Not a small twig, a thick branch, the kind that takes real force to break. It came from my left, maybe 30 feet away, though in the dense thicket it was impossible to tell exactly. I froze, listening. Another snap, then another. Something was moving through the rhododendrons parallel to me. My first thought was, Bear 47. Maybe he was mobile after all, and I'd disturbed him. But bears, even large ones, move quietly through vegetation. They're incredibly good at slipping through dense cover without making much noise. Whatever was making these sounds wasn't being subtle about it. "Hey, bear," I called out, following protocol. If it was a bear, the sound of a human voice would usually make it move away. "Hey, I'm here. Make some noise." The crashing sound stopped. Silence. Even the birds had gone quiet. I waited, my heart pounding, straining to hear any movement. Then it started again, but this time it was moving. Not away from me, parallel to me, keeping pace. I could hear branches breaking, stems snapping, something big pushing through the thicket. But I couldn't see anything. The rhododendrons were too dense. I pulled out my bear spray, a canister of concentrated pepper spray that's the standard defense against aggressive bears, and continued moving forward. My rational brain was trying to catalog possibilities. A bear, definitely. Maybe a very large male, bigger than I'd estimated. Or possibly two bears fighting, which would explain the noise. But bears don't follow people. They avoid us. And whatever this was, it was actively keeping pace with me. I checked my telemetry receiver. Bear 47's signal was still coming from ahead, still stationary. Whatever was pacing me, it wasn't my tagged bear. The branches to my left shook violently, and I spun toward the movement, my finger on the trigger of the bear spray. Through the dense green tangle, I caught a glimpse of something dark, something massive. It was maybe 20 feet away, separated from me by impenetrable vegetation. "Go away!" I shouted, trying to sound aggressive, dominant. "Get out of here!" The dark shape shifted, and more branches snapped, but not small branches at the top of the thicket. These were the thick, woody stems at the base, the kind that are 3 to 4 inches in diameter. They were breaking like twigs. A new sound reached me. Breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing, like something massive drawing air. It had a wet quality to it that made my skin crawl. I started moving faster, abandoning any pretense of tracking Bear 47, just trying to get out of this thicket. But the thing kept pace. Every time I pushed forward, I'd hear it moving beside me, sometimes ahead of me, always just out of sight. The branches would shake and sway, marking its progress through the dense vegetation. Then I realized something that made my blood run cold. I was moving in one direction, pushing, squeezing, crawling through gaps in the rhododendrons. It was taking me 10 minutes to cover 50 feet, but this thing, whatever it was moving freely, easily, keeping up with me without any apparent effort. Like the vegetation wasn't even there. I came to a particularly dense section where the rhododendrons had grown into an almost solid wall. I had to get on my hands and knees and crawl under the lowest branches, my pack scraping against the stems above me. It was claustrophobic, suffocating, and I was completely vulnerable. That's when I felt it. A vibration through the ground, rhythmic and heavy. Footsteps. But not the footsteps of a bear, which distribute their weight across 4 paws. These felt like something massive walking on 2 legs. I crawled faster, panic overriding exhaustion, dragging myself through the narrow space. Behind me, I heard the rhododendron branches snapping in sequence, like something was walking straight through them. Getting closer. I emerged from under the low branches and found myself in a slightly more open area. A tiny clearing maybe 10 feet across, where a large tree had fallen years ago, creating a gap in the rhododendron canopy. I scrambled to my feet and spun around, bear spray raised. The rhododendrons behind me were still moving, shaking, a line of disturbance coming straight toward the clearing. I could track its progress by watching the branches move, like something was pushing through them from underneath. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the clearing. The last few branches swayed and went still. I stood there, breathing hard, my bear spray aimed at the spot where the branches had stopped moving. Whatever it was right there, maybe 15 feet away, just on the other side of that wall of green. A full minute passed. 2 minutes. Nothing moved. The forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just me and whatever was watching me from the thicket. Then I saw it. An eye. It was reflecting light, probably from my bright orange pack or my clothing, and it was huge, not bear-sized, bigger. It was positioned maybe 7 feet off the ground, looking at me through a tiny gap in the branches, and it didn't blink. My sister Etta had given me a whistle for emergencies, one of those high-pitched ones that can be heard for miles. I pulled it out with shaking hands and blew it as hard as I could. 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for distress. The eye disappeared. And then the thing moved. It didn't run away. It started circling. I could track it by sound and by the moving branches. It was going around the clearing, staying in the thick rhododendrons, keeping that same distance, like a predator circling prey. I blew the whistle again. 3 more blasts, then turned and ran. I crashed through rhododendrons without caring about direction, just trying to get away, to get out of this hell. Branches whipped my face and arms. My pack caught and tore on stems. Behind me, I could hear it following, those massive branches snapping, that rhythmic crashing growing closer. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that green maze. But, finally, suddenly, the rhododendrons thinned, and I burst out into open hardwood forest. I kept running for another 100 yards before I risked looking back. The rhododendron thicket stood there, dark and dense and silent. Nothing emerged, but I swear I could still see branches moving deep inside, something large shifting in the shadows. I made it back to my truck in record time, cutting straight through the forest, regardless of terrain. When I got there, I found my friend and colleague Vance just pulling into the parking area. He'd been working a different section of the forest and had heard my distress whistle from over a mile away. He wanted to go back in with me to investigate, but I refused. Whatever was in that thicket, I wasn't going near it again. We filed a report, noted the location, and I spent the next week trying to convince myself it had been a bear. Just a really big bear, maybe standing on its hind legs, that I'd misperceived through the dense vegetation. Except bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods. They don't snap 4-inch branches like twigs, and they don't have eyes that reflect light from 7 feet off the ground. A month later, We recovered Bear 47's collar. It was found on the ground in that same rhododendron thicket, the leather strap torn completely through. Not chewed, torn, like something had just ripped it off. We never found any sign of Bear 47 himself. I still work as a wildlife biologist, but I refuse any assignments that involve those rhododendron thickets. My colleagues call them laurel hells, but that name doesn't do them justice, because hell implies you know what you're dealing with. What I encountered in that thicket wasn't something I could identify or classify. It was huge, deliberate, and intelligent enough to circle prey before moving in. And somewhere in the high forests of the Virginia-West Virginia border, it's still out there, hidden in vegetation so thick that you could be 3 feet away and never see it. If you hike in Appalachia and come across one of those dense rhododendron thickets, don't go in alone. And if you hear something big moving through the branches beside you, something that breaks stems like toothpicks, don't try to investigate. Just get out. Run if you have to, because some things in these mountains are big enough and smart enough to stay hidden. And the rhododendron hells aren't just difficult to navigate, they're perfect hunting grounds for something that doesn't want to be seen. Can you imagine losing half a night with no memory, but your boots prove you walked for miles? That's what happened to me on Roan Mountain, and the evidence I found suggests I wasn't walking alone. My name is Neo, and I'm a meteorology graduate student at UNC Asheville. My research focuses on high-altitude weather patterns in the southern Appalachians, which means I spend a lot of time at remote weather stations, collecting data and maintaining equipment. It's solitary work, but I prefer it that way. Numbers don't lie. Weather follows predictable patterns. There's a comfort in that certainty. In June 2024, I had permission to camp overnight at the Roan Mountain Weather Observation Site, one of the highest points along the North Carolina-Tennessee border at just over 6,000 feet. The summit area is unique. Instead of forest, it's covered in grassy balds, these open meadows that shouldn't exist at this elevation. Nobody knows exactly why they're treeless. Some say it's soil chemistry, others blame historical grazing, but the real answer is we don't know. I'd made the hike dozens of times, always during the day. This was my first overnight stay, and I'd planned it during the new moon to get the darkest skies possible for some astrophotography alongside my weather work. I had a full pack, tent, sleeping bag, research equipment, cameras, food for 2 days. I reached the summit around 4 p.m., set up my tent in a designated camping area near the old observation tower, and spent the afternoon calibrating my instruments and taking baseline readings. The weather was perfect. Temperature in the low 60s, no wind, crystal clear skies. You could see for what felt like 100 miles in every direction, the ridge lines rolling away like waves in an ocean of green. As the sun set, I made dinner on my camp stove and watched the light fade from the sky. This high up, with no light pollution, the transition from day to night is spectacular. Stars began appearing one by one, then dozens, then thousands. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. I set up my camera for long exposures and settled in for what I expected to be a routine night of data collection. Around 9:30 p.m., I noticed something odd. There were lights moving in the valley below me, maybe 2,000 feet down the mountainside. At first, I thought they were headlamps, other hikers on one of the lower trails, but the movement was wrong. They weren't following any trail I knew. They were moving in a geometric pattern, forming straight lines that intersected at sharp angles, like someone was mapping out coordinates on the landscape. I watched them for maybe 10 minutes, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The lights were too bright to be headlamps. They had this odd quality to them, almost like they were glowing rather than shining. And there were 4 of them, moving independently, but in perfect coordination, creating this angular grid pattern across the mountainside. Then one of the lights started moving up the mountain, not following the trail, just moving straight up the slope, impossibly fast. In less than a minute, it had covered what should have taken an hour to hike. The other 3 lights followed, all of them racing up the mountainside directly toward my position. My scientific training was screaming that this didn't make sense. Nothing moves that fast up a mountain. Nothing glows like that. But I was watching it happen, and the lights were getting closer. I stood up, uncertain whether to retreat to my tent or stay where I was. The lights were maybe 500 feet below the summit now, close enough that I could see they were illuminating the trees and rocks around them as they passed. The light had a blue-white quality, like mercury vapor, and it seemed to pulse slightly, like a heartbeat. Then they reached the edge of the bald, where the forest ended and the grass began. And they stopped. All 4 lights hung there, maybe 100 yards from my tent, at the tree line. Just hovering, not moving, not making any sound, just these 4 sources of cold light positioned in a perfect square formation. I'm not ashamed to say I was terrified. Every instinct was telling me to run, to get off this mountain, but I was miles from the trailhead, and it was full dark. Running down a mountain trail at night with just a headlamp is a good way to break an ankle or worse. I was stuck. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, thinking maybe I could at least document this, but my phone was dead. Completely dead, even though I'd charged it to full before leaving the car. I tried my camera. Same thing. Dead. 3 different cameras, all with fresh batteries, all completely dead. The lights started moving again. Not toward me. They began moving in straight lines across the bald, creating what looked like a grid pattern. Northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest. They'd streak from one point to another, pause, then move to the next point. Like they were surveying, measuring, mapping. I don't know how long I stood there watching them. It felt like hours, but I had no way to check the time with all my electronics dead. The lights just kept moving in their geometric pattern, never varying their speed or height, and I couldn't look away. It was like they were hypnotic, pulling my attention, making it impossible to think about anything else. At some point, I noticed the fog. It had come up suddenly. One moment the night was clear, the next I was surrounded by thick mist that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. The lights were still visible through it, glowing orbs in the gray, but everything else disappeared. I should go into my tent, I remember thinking. I should get out of sight. But I couldn't make my body move. I just stood there, watching the lights move in their precise grid pattern through the fog, feeling like time itself had stopped. And then, I don't remember anything else. I woke up lying on my back in the grass, soaking wet from dew, the morning sun hitting my face. For a moment, I was completely disoriented. Where was I? How did I get here? What time was it? Then memory came flooding back. The lights, the fog, the grid pattern. I sat up quickly, looking around. My campsite was maybe 50 feet away, my tent still standing exactly as I'd left it. The sky was clear, the morning beautiful. Birds were singing. Everything was normal. I checked my watch, except I wasn't wearing one. I looked at my phone, remembered it had died. I found it in my pocket and tried to turn it on, and to my surprise, it worked. Full battery, like it had never died at all. The time showed 6:47 a.m. I'd last checked my watch around 9:30 p.m. the previous night. Almost 9 hours were just gone. I had no memory of anything after the fog appeared. But that wasn't the worst part. I was covered in mud. My boots, my pants, my hands, all caked with dried mud. And not just any mud. This was the dark, peaty soil that you only find in the boggy areas of the high balds, the wet depressions that collect water. I walked back to my tent, and that's when I noticed the tracks. Footprints, dozens of them, but not around my campsite. They led away from my tent in a straight line across the bald, heading northeast. My boot prints. I recognized the distinctive tread pattern. The line went on for maybe 200 yards before disappearing into the forest edge. But it was the other tracks that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with my boot prints were other marks. Not footprints, but indentations in the grass. 3 parallel lines, each about 6 inches long, spaced evenly apart. Like something with 3 toes, or prongs had been walking beside me, and these marks appeared every few feet, alternating sides of my footprints, as if something had been escorting me. I tried to access my weather instruments, hoping they'd recorded something during the night that might explain what happened. They were all wiped, every single one. Not broken, not damaged, just reset to factory settings with all data from the previous 12 hours erased. My cameras were the same. All three of them showed full batteries now, but every photo I'd taken, the sunset, the stars, everything was deleted. The memory cards weren't corrupted. They'd been formatted, wiped clean. I packed up my campsite as quickly as possible and started hiking down. My legs felt strange, like I'd been walking for hours. And when I really paid attention, I noticed my calves were sore, my feet were blistered, and my knees ached. The kind of soreness you get from walking miles and miles. At the trailhead, I ran into a park ranger who was checking permits. His name was Imran, and he'd worked Roan Mountain for 15 years. I asked him, trying to sound casual, if he'd seen anything unusual the previous night. He gave me a long look. "You camped up on the Bald last night?" I nodded. "You remember much about it?" "Not really," I admitted. "I have these gaps, missing time." He sighed and pulled out a notebook. "You're the fourth person this season. All the same story. Lights in the valley, electronics dying, missing hours, mud everywhere. None of you remember what you did during the gaps." "What's happening up there?" I asked. "Don't know," Imran said. "Been happening since before I started working here. Usually around the new moon, always on the Balds, always the same pattern. Grid-like lights, missing time. Park Service doesn't like to talk about it. Bad for tourism." He showed me photos in his notebook, other hikers' boots, all caked with the same dark mud. GPS tracks from people who'd logged their hikes, showing impossible patterns. One person's track showed them walking in a perfect straight line for 8 miles across terrain that included cliffs and ravines, places you literally cannot walk. Another showed someone moving back and forth between 2 points exactly 1,000 meters apart, like they were being tested. "Where does the mud come from?" I asked. "That's the thing," Imran said. "The bog areas where that soil type exists, they're in spots you can't reach without technical climbing gear. Steep ravines, cliff faces. No reason anyone would be walking around up there in the dark, but that's where you all end up." I drove home that day and tried to process what had happened. I pulled up my phone's GPS history, and there it was. During those missing hours, I'd walked. A lot. The track showed me leaving my campsite and moving across the mountain in straight lines, forming a zigzag pattern. Each leg of the zigzag was exactly 437 meters long. My friend Harold from the geology department later analyzed the pattern and told me it matched nothing he'd ever seen in nature. But the precision suggested intentional design, mathematical, artificial. I've been back to my apartment for 3 weeks now, and I keep finding things. Pieces of plants in my boot treads that don't grow anywhere near where I was supposed to be. A small stone in my pocket that I don't remember picking up. My colleague in mineralogy says it's a type of quartz that's only found in one specific formation on Roan Mountain, in an area that requires technical climbing to access. And then there are the dreams. Every night, I dream I'm standing in the fog on the summit, and the lights are moving in their grid pattern. But in the dreams, I'm not watching them from outside. I'm walking with them, following their precise paths. And there are others walking too, dozens of them, all moving in synchronized lines across the mountain. I haven't told anyone what I see in those dreams. I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know I'm not going back to Roan Mountain. My advisor was disappointed when I told him I'm switching my research focus to lower elevations, but I didn't tell him the real reason. Because whatever those lights are, they're not just observing, they're collecting. And when they find someone alone on the mountain during the new moon, they take them walking in precise, measured patterns. Where you go and what you're being measured for, I don't know. Your conscious mind doesn't remember, but your body remembers. Your boots remember. And the GPS doesn't lie. You walked in straight lines across impossible terrain, covering distances that should have killed you, leaving the kind of tracks that suggest you weren't alone. If you're planning to camp on any of the high balds in this region, Roan, Grassy Ridge, any of them, avoid the new moon. And if you see lights moving in geometric patterns, lights that move with mathematical precision, get off the mountain. Don't watch them. Don't wait to see what happens. Because the missing hours you get back won't stay missing forever. Eventually, the memories start returning. And when they do, you'll understand that those lights were never just lights. They were markers, waypoints, and you were being led along a route that someone, or something, had planned out with terrifying precision. Would you follow the sound of children playing in a place where no children have lived for decades? I did, and what I found in that abandoned valley changed everything I thought I knew about the past staying in the past. My name is Michaela, and I'm a documentary filmmaker specializing in Appalachian history. I've spent the last 5 years traveling through the mountains, recording oral histories, and filming the remnants of communities that were displaced when the national parks were created in the 1930s. It's important work, preserving memories before they're completely lost. But sometimes I think some memories don't want to be preserved. They want to be left alone. In April 2024, I traveled to Appalachia Valley in North Carolina, one of the most remote sections of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Before the park was established, Appalachia was a thriving settlement. Over 1,200 people living in a self-sufficient community with farms, schools, churches, and homes. Then in 1928, the government decided this land would become part of the park. Most residents were forced out, though some were granted lifetime leases. By the 1940s, the valley was essentially abandoned. Today, a handful of preserved structures remain: old homesteads, a schoolhouse, and Palmer Chapel, where the community once worshipped. The National Park Service maintains them as historical exhibits, but they're shells, really. Empty buildings that once held lives, now holding only echoes. I arrived on a Tuesday morning with my equipment: cameras, audio recorders, drone for aerial shots. The valley was spectacular, surrounded by high ridges, with Palmer Creek running through the center. Spring had just arrived, wildflowers blooming across the meadows where houses used to stand. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like the valley was watching me. I started at the old Beech Grove School, a white wooden structure that still stands near Palmer Creek. According to records, the school served the community's children until the late 1930s. I'd read that the building had a strange history. The original schoolhouse had been burned down by disgruntled residents who weren't getting enough funding from the county government. They burned it deliberately, then asked for a new one, knowing the state's mandatory attendance laws would force the government to comply. The replacement school, the one still standing, was built quickly and used until the community was forced out. I wanted to film the interior, capture the feeling of what it must have been like for those children, knowing they'd be leaving their home forever. The door wasn't locked. Nothing in Appalachia is locked. The Park Service trusts that visitors will respect these historic sites. I stepped inside and the temperature dropped immediately. It was maybe 40 degrees outside, but inside the schoolhouse it felt closer to freezing. My breath misted in the air. The interior was sparse, old, wooden desks arranged in rows, a chalkboard on the wall, a potbelly stove in the corner that hadn't held fire in 80 years. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like suspended snow. I set up my camera on a tripod and started filming, narrating the history I'd researched. This schoolhouse served approximately 60 children from the Appalachia community. Classes were held year-round, with older children helping teach younger ones. When the park was established, these children were forced to leave, moving to towns across Haywood County, many of them never returning to the valley they called home. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Children's laughter, faint but unmistakable, coming from outside the building. I stopped recording and listened. It continued. The high, bright sound of kids playing, the kind of carefree noise you hear on any playground. But there were no children in Appalachia that morning. I'd seen the parking area when I arrived. My car was the only one there. I stepped outside, scanning the meadow. Nothing, no movement. The laughter had stopped. Just wind moving through the grass and the distant sound of Palmer Creek. Probably hikers, I told myself. A family with kids, walking one of the trails. Sound carries strangely in valleys like this. Totally logical explanation. I went back inside and continued filming. Within 5 minutes, I heard it again. This time closer. And this time, I could make out words. Children's voices singing something, a rhyme or song I didn't recognize. The melody was old-fashioned, the kind of tune you'd hear in folk music collections. I grabbed my audio recorder and stepped outside, holding it up to capture the sound. The singing was coming from the direction of Palmer Chapel, maybe 200 yards away across the meadow. I could see the white structure clearly, its steeple rising against the ridge behind it. The singing continued, multiple voices, maybe a dozen children. They seemed to be inside the chapel. And now I could make out the words. Standing tall, where the ridges meet the sky. Standing tall, where the old ones come to die. The melody was haunting, repetitive, and the lyrics made no sense. Standing Tall was a reference to Appalachia itself. The Cherokee had named it that after the way the ridges surrounded the valley. But where the old ones come to die, that wasn't part of any historical song I'd ever encountered. Professional curiosity overrode unease. If there were people in the chapel singing old songs, this could be amazing footage. Maybe a reenactment group, or descendants of the original families visiting. I grabbed my camera and started walking across the meadow toward the chapel. The singing continued, never varying, never stopping. Same verse, over and over, in those high, clear children's voices. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The chapel's windows were dark. If people were inside singing, there should be movement, shadows, something. But the windows showed nothing but black. I reached the chapel steps and the singing stopped. Instantly, mid-word, like someone had cut a wire. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind had died. I stood there on the chapel steps, my camera rolling, my heart pounding, and called out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" No response. I tried the door. It opened easily, hinges creaking, revealing the interior of Palmer Chapel. Empty. Completely empty. Wooden pews arranged in rows, a simple altar at the front, windows on either side letting in gray light. Dust covered everything, thick, undisturbed dust on every surface. If anyone had been inside recently, there would be footprints, disturbances in the dust, but there was nothing, just decades of accumulated dust, smooth and untouched. I stepped inside anyway, filming everything. The chapel was small, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with room for perhaps 50 people. The air smelled old, like paper and decay. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, leaving clear prints in the dust. That's when I noticed the wildflowers. They were arranged on the pews in neat little bundles, fresh wildflowers, mountain laurel and trillium and rhododendron blooms. Not dried, not wilted. Fresh, like someone had just picked them that morning and placed them carefully on each pew. My hands were shaking as I filmed them. Fresh flowers in a building that showed no signs of recent human presence. Fresh flowers arranged with care. 1 bouquet per pew, 12 bundles in total. I turned to leave, to get out of the chapel and back to my car, and that's when I saw the window, the one facing the school, pressed against the glass from the inside. Impossible, because I was inside and nothing was behind me, was a small handprint. Made in the dust on the window, a child-sized handprint, fingers spread, pressed against the glass like someone waving hello, or goodbye. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran out of that chapel, across the meadow, back to the schoolhouse where my equipment was. I was throwing gear into my bags, hands shaking, when I heard the singing again. This time behind me, inside the schoolhouse. I spun around. The room was empty, but the singing was clear now, coming from all around me. The same song, the same verse. But this time I could hear individual voices. A girl with a lisp, a boy whose voice cracked on the high notes, a child who couldn't quite stay on pitch. Real children. Or the memory of real children, singing in a school they'd been forced to leave 80 years ago. "I'm sorry," I said out loud, my voice breaking. "I'm sorry they made you leave. I'm sorry this happened to you." The singing stopped. For a moment there was just silence. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Small feet running across the wooden floor, dozens of them, running in all directions. The sound of children playing, chasing, each other laughing. The sounds a school should have. The sounds this school hadn't held in 8 decades. And then one by one, the desks moved. Just slightly. A few inches. Like invisible children were sitting down, getting ready for class. The old wood creaked as weight settled onto the seats, even though nothing visible was there. My camera was still recording. Later, when I reviewed the footage, it captured everything. The desks moving on their own, the sound of children's voices and footsteps, even the temperature drop that made my breath visible. But what it captured most clearly, in the final frame before I grabbed the camera and ran, was the chalkboard. Someone had written on it in fresh white chalk. A message that hadn't been there when I'd started filming. "We're still here. We never left. Tell them we never left." I drove out of Cataloochee that day and didn't stop until I reached Asheville. I called my friend Julietta, a historian who specializes in the park's displacement history, and told her what happened. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Michaela," she finally said, "I need to tell you something. After the government bought up the land in Cataloochee, not everyone left. There are records, unofficial ones, diaries and letters, that mention families who refused to go. Some of them had children who'd never known any other home. The Park Service doesn't like to talk about it, but..." She paused. I waited. "There's a story about a dozen children from the valley. Their families had already been forced out, but these kids kept coming back. They'd walk miles through the mountains to return to Cataloochee, to the school, to the chapel, to the only home they'd ever known. Eventually, they stopped showing up in the new towns where their families had moved. No one knows what happened to them. The assumption was they died of exposure or accident in the mountains, but their bodies were never found." "When?" I asked, though I already knew somehow. "Spring of 1942, April, specifically. About this time of year." I looked at my calendar. April 17th, 2024. I looked up the historical date. The children had disappeared on April 17th, 1942, exactly 82 years ago to the day. The footage I captured that day has been viewed by several experts, paranormal investigators, audio analysts, historians. Everyone agrees on one thing. The voices are real, and they're children's voices. But they can't be children's voices because there were no children there. I've submitted the footage to the Park Service with a request that they acknowledge what happened to those families, to those children who couldn't accept being forced from their home. I'm still waiting for a response, but I know what I experienced. I know what I heard and saw and recorded. Cataloochee Valley isn't empty, even though the official story says everyone left. Some residents never did leave. They're still there, in the school and the chapel, living out their routines, keeping their community alive in the only way they can, standing tall where the ridges meet the sky, standing tall where they died, refusing to leave the home they loved. If you visit Cataloochee, listen carefully. You might hear them too, the children who never left. And if you do, please don't disturb them. They've lost enough already. Let them have their valley, their school, their chapel. Let them have the home they died trying to keep. Tell them we remember. Tell them they didn't disappear without a trace. Tell them their story matters, because that's all any of us really want, isn't it? to be remembered, to have our story told, to know that our home, the place we loved, hasn't been completely erased from history. The children of Appalachia are still standing tall, and they always will be. Picture this. A trail you know perfectly suddenly leads somewhere that shouldn't exist. I've hiked Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness dozens of times, and I can promise you, what happened to me there defies every map, every trail guide, and every law of physical geography I thought I understood. My name is Kamiya, and I'm a wilderness guide based out of Robbinsville, North Carolina. I've been leading backpacking trips through the southern Appalachians for 8 years, and Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock has always been one of my favorite areas to work. The old-growth forest there is magical. Some of those yellow poplars are over 400 years old, standing 100 feet tall with trunks 20 feet around. It's one of the last virgin forests in the eastern United States, a cathedral of ancient trees that somehow escaped the logging that devastated most of Appalachia in the early 1900s. I know every trail in that wilderness, the 2-mile memorial loop the tourists walk, the more challenging routes that cut through Slick Rock Creek watershed, the junction points where trails intersect. I've hiked them in all seasons, in all weather. I could navigate them blindfolded, or at least I thought I could until September 12th, 2024. I was doing a solo reconnaissance hike, scouting a route for a client group I'd be leading the following week. Nothing complicated. Just a 15-mile day hike starting from the Joyce Kilmer parking area, taking the Memorial Loop first, then cutting over to the Naked Ground Trail junction, and looping back via Howe Lead Trail. I'd done this exact route at least 30 times before. The day started perfectly. September in the mountains is gorgeous. Cool mornings, warm afternoons. The first hints of autumn color just starting to show. I hit the trail at 7 a.m. with a light pack. Water, snacks, first aid kit, map, and compass. Out of habit, though, I didn't need them. The Memorial Loop was peaceful, the ancient poplars standing like silent witnesses to centuries of history. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating the forest floor where ferns grew thick between massive root systems. I completed the Memorial Loop in about an hour, then headed northeast toward the Naked Ground Junction. This section of trail climbs steadily through old-growth forest, crossing several small creek tributaries before reaching the junction at around 3,200 feet elevation. It's well-marked, well-maintained, and I'd passed through it so many times I could close my eyes and describe every landmark. At 9:30 a.m. I reached the junction, or what should have been the junction. The trail signs were there, 3 wooden posts with carved arrows pointing in different directions. But the directions were wrong, completely wrong. The sign pointing left said, Memorial Loop, 0.5 miles. That was impossible. I'd left the Memorial Loop 2 hours ago and had hiked at least 4 miles northeast. There was no way the loop was only half a mile away. The sign pointing right said, Slick Rock Creek, 2 miles. Also wrong. Slick Rock Creek was southwest of my position at least 8 miles away, and there was no trail that direction anyway. The sign pointing straight ahead said, Stratton Meadows, 3.5 miles. I stood there staring at that sign for a full minute because Stratton Meadows doesn't exist. I know every named location in Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness, and there is no place called Stratton Meadows. Not on any map, not in any trail guide, not in any historical record I've ever seen. I pulled out my map and compass, thinking maybe I'd somehow gotten completely turned around despite hiking a trail I knew intimately. According to my compass, I was facing northeast, exactly where I should be. According to the elevation on my altimeter watch, I was at 3,380 feet, exactly right for the Naked Ground Junction. But according to the trail signs, nothing made sense. I tried my phone's GPS. No signal this deep in the wilderness, but the downloaded maps should still work. Except when I opened the app, my position marker wasn't showing up. The map displayed fine. I could see all the trails, the junctions, the elevations. But the blue dot that should show my location was just Gone. Like I wasn't anywhere at all. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. In 8 years of guiding, I'd never gotten lost, never even been confused about my position. But standing at this familiar junction that suddenly wasn't familiar at all, I felt the first real spike of fear. Logic said, go back the way I'd come. Retrace my steps to the memorial loop, return to my truck, and figure this out with proper maps and maybe another guide. But when I turned around to head back southwest, the trail behind me looked different. The trees were wrong. I'd been hiking through old-growth yellow poplars and hemlocks for the last 2 hours, walking under that distinctive high canopy with relatively clear understory. But the trail behind me now cut through dense second-growth forest. Smaller trees, thick rhododendron undergrowth, the kind of vegetation you find in areas that were logged and have been regrowing for 70 or 80 years. I walked back about 100 yards, and the forest just got denser, younger, smaller. None of the landmarks I'd passed on the way up were there. No creek crossings. No moss-covered boulder that looked like a sleeping bear. No distinctive twin poplar trees growing from a single root system. I walked back to the junction. The signs still said the same impossible things. My training kicked in. When you're lost, stay put. Make yourself easy to find. Don't panic. Except I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was supposed to be. The geography just didn't match reality anymore. I decided to take the trail that claimed to lead back to Memorial Loop, the one that said 0.5 miles. Even if the distance was wrong, at least it pointed in the generally correct direction, southwest, back toward the start. I started walking. The trail was familiar. The same width, the same maintenance level, the same Forest Service markers every quarter mile. But something felt off. The light was wrong, too dim, like the canopy overhead was thicker than it should be. The temperature was dropping, even though it was approaching midday when it should be warming up, and there were no sounds. No birds, no squirrels rustling in the leaves, no insects buzzing. Just my footsteps, and my breathing, and an oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. After hiking for what felt like an hour, though my watch said only 15 minutes had passed, I arrived at another junction. Same wooden posts, same carved arrows, but different names. And one of the signs said, Stratton Meadows, 3.0 miles. I was going the wrong direction, or the meadows were moving, or I was losing my mind. I tried the other direction at this new junction, heading what my compass said was southeast. This should have been impossible geometry. There's no trail that runs southeast from Naked Ground Junction. But I was following a clear, well-maintained trail through forest that kept shifting in character. Old growth, then second growth, then something in between. Yellow poplars, then oak and hickory, then hemlock groves. Another junction. Same impossible signs, with Stratton Meadows now listed as 2.5 miles straight ahead. I was being led somewhere. Not randomly lost, but deliberately guided to a destination that shouldn't exist. And the distance to that destination was counting down with each junction I passed. My hands were shaking as I checked my watch. It was 9:47 a.m. 17 minutes had passed since I'd reached the first wrong junction, even though I'd been hiking for what felt like 3 hours. Time wasn't working right. Distance wasn't working right. The forest itself was changing around me with each step. I found myself thinking about the stories old-timers tell about the mountains, about places that move, about hollows that appear only at certain times, under certain conditions, about forests that remember things, old paths, old settlements, old names, and sometimes show them to travelers who wander into the wrong place at the wrong time. At the next junction, Stratton Meadows was listed as 2.0 miles, and below the distance someone had carved additional words into the sign. No one leaves, everyone stays. That's when I started running. I didn't follow any of the sign trails. I just picked a direction and ran, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen logs, not caring about proper trail etiquette or leave no trace principles. I just needed to get away from those junctions, from those impossible signs, from whatever Stratton Meadows was and why it was getting closer. I ran for what felt like an eternity, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. The forest blurred around me, old trees and young trees and no trees, sunlight and shadow and complete darkness, all flowing past like I was moving through layers of different forests occupying the same space. And then suddenly I burst out of the tree line and into a clearing I recognized. The Joyce Kilmer parking lot. My truck, sitting exactly where I'd left it 4 hours, or 17 minutes, ago. I collapsed against the truck, gasping for air, my heart hammering. My watch said 9:53 a.m. 6 minutes had passed since I'd started running. 6 minutes to cover what should have been miles of terrain. I didn't go back into the forest that day. I drove straight to the Forest Service office in Robbinsville and filed a report. I told them the trail signs at Naked Ground Junction were showing incorrect information and needed to be checked. I didn't mention Stratton Meadows, or the impossible junctions, or the forest that kept changing. The ranger who took my report was young, probably new to the area. He looked at me strangely and said, "There are no trail signs at Naked Ground Junction. That junction isn't marked. Experienced hikers are supposed to know which fork to take based on the terrain." I pulled out my phone to show him the photos I'd taken of the signs. But there were no photos. My camera roll showed the pictures I'd taken of the ancient poplars on the memorial loop, then nothing. Hours of hiking, multiple junctions, dozens of impossible signs. All missing from my photo record. He suggested I'd gotten confused, maybe experienced a bit of altitude sickness or dehydration. He was polite, but I could tell he thought I was either incompetent or making it up. I went back 2 days later with another guide named Jaylene, someone I trusted. I wanted a witness. We hiked together from the parking lot, following the exact route I'd taken. We reached Naked Ground Junction at 10:45 a.m. No signs. Just 3 trails meeting at a recognizable junction exactly as it should be. The forest was all old growth, exactly as it should be. The distances and directions all made perfect sense. "This is the junction?" Jaylene asked. "Looks normal to me." "It is normal," I said quietly. "Now." But I took out my compass and did something I'd learned from my grandfather, who'd been a surveyor in these mountains for 40 years. I walked the exact perimeter of the junction, taking compass bearings every 10 feet, mapping the magnetic fields. The readings were wrong, not dramatically wrong, but off by just enough degrees that if you were using a compass here, you'd end up walking in slow circles, coming back to the same place over and over. The geology here was doing something to magnetic north, creating a zone maybe 100 yards across where compasses couldn't be trusted. "What are you finding?" Jaylene asked. "An explanation," I said. "Maybe." But it wasn't a complete explanation. It might account for compass confusion, but it didn't explain the signs that appeared and disappeared. It didn't explain the forest changing character. It didn't explain Stratton Meadows, or the counting down distances, or time moving at different speeds. That night, I did research. I went through every historical record I could find about Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness. Most of it was about the logging history, the memorial forest designation, the wilderness protection status. Standard stuff. But buried in a scanned archive of Forest Service reports from 1973, I found something. A memo about the wilderness designation process, discussing which areas would be included. And in that memo, one sentence: recommend excluding Stratton Meadows area due to ongoing jurisdictional dispute and reported access difficulties. Stratton Meadows had existed, or maybe still existed somewhere between the maps and the mountains. I searched further and found a surveyor's note from 1938. Unable to maintain consistent bearings in the Stratton Meadows vicinity. Compass readings unreliable. Recommend remapping with different methods. And a forestry report from 1954. 3 separate survey parties have produced 3 different maps of the Stratton Meadows area. Variations exceed acceptable margin of error. The terrain appears to resist accurate mapping. The last reference I found was a handwritten note in a 1968 Ranger's log. S. Meadows trail signs removed per supervisor order. Too many hikers reporting confusion and disorientation in area. Better to leave unmarked. So it had happened before, multiple times. Hikers getting confused, trails that didn't make sense, a place that resisted mapping and caused disorientation, and the Forest Service's solution had been to remove the signs and pretend it didn't exist. I still guide in Joyce-Kilmer Slick Rock. It's still one of my favorite places, but I don't go to Naked Ground Junction anymore, especially not alone. And I warn my clients about what I call magnetic anomaly zones, places where compasses might not work right, where you need to rely on terrain features instead of instruments. I don't tell them about Stratton Meadows. I don't tell them about trails that lead to places that shouldn't exist, or forests that remember old paths and sometimes reveal them to travelers who aren't looking for them. But late at night, I wonder, what's in Stratton Meadows? What's at that destination the signs kept pointing toward, with the distance counting down? And what did that carved message mean? No one leaves, everyone stays. Were there other hikers who kept walking, who didn't run when I did, who followed those impossible signs all the way to wherever they led? And if so, are they still there, in a place that exists between the maps, in a forest that remembers what used to be? I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. Because some questions, once you know the answer, change you. Some places, once you find them, don't let you leave unchanged. If you hike in Joyce-Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness, stick to the marked trails. If you find yourself at a junction with signs that don't match your map, turn around immediately. Don't try to make sense of it. Don't follow where they point. And if you ever see a sign for Stratton Meadows, with a distance counting down, run. Run back the way you came and don't stop until you reach your car. 'Cause some destinations in these mountains aren't meant to be reached. Some places exist only in the spaces between, where the forest remembers things that maps have forgotten. And once you start walking toward them, they don't want to let you go. Ever notice the landscape itself breathing around you? I was fishing alone at dusk when I realized the sound of the creek was wrong. It had rhythm, like lungs, and what I thought was a log jam turned out to be something that should never exist in these mountains. My name is Zoya, and I'm a hydrologist for the Tennessee Valley Authority. I spend most of my time studying water systems in the southern Appalachians, stream flows, watershed health, aquatic ecosystems. It's technical work, but I love it because it gets me into backcountry areas most people never see. Remote creek drainages, unnamed tributaries, places where the water still runs pure and cold like it has for thousands of years. Big Laurel Creek in eastern Tennessee is one of those places. It's a medium-sized stream that drains a valley maybe 5 miles long, feeding eventually into the Pigeon River. The drainage is steep, heavily forested, with no roads or development. Perfect for what I needed. Baseline data on a pristine watershed to compare against logged areas. I'd been camping at the creek for 3 days in late October 2024, taking water samples, measuring flow rates, documenting the substrate composition. Solo fieldwork in remote areas is standard for my job. I'm comfortable with solitude, comfortable in the woods, and I'd done this kind of work dozens of times before. On my last evening, I decided to do some fishing, not for data, just for me. The creek was full of wild brook trout, and I'd brought my fly rod, thinking I might catch dinner. I found a good spot about a 1/4 mile upstream from my camp, where the creek widened into a deep pool behind a massive tangle of downed trees. It was that perfect hour just before sunset, when the light turns golden and everything feels suspended between day and night. The air was cool, maybe mid-50s, with that crisp autumn smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke from somewhere far off. I was casting into the pool, watching my fly drift along the current line, completely at peace. That's when I noticed the sound was off. I'd been listening to the creek for 3 days straight. That constant white noise of water moving over rocks becomes background music when you're camping. But now, standing there, in the golden light, I realized the sound had changed. It wasn't the steady rush of current anymore. It had become rhythmic, regular, like breathing, in, out, the volume rising and falling in a pattern that water doesn't naturally make. I stopped casting and just listened, trying to figure out what I was hearing. Could be a beaver dam upstream regulating flow, could be a strange echo effect in the valley, could be my ears playing tricks after days of constant creek noise. But then I felt it. A pressure change in the air, synchronized with the breathing sound. My ears would pop slightly on the inhale, release on the exhale, like standing next to something massive that was drawing in air and pushing it back out. I looked at the logjam blocking the far end of the pool. It was enormous, maybe 40 feet wide, a tangled mass of downed hemlocks and oaks and pine trees that must have accumulated over decades of floods. The kind of natural debris dam that's common in steep mountain streams. Trees fall, floods move them, they wedge against boulders, and create these massive wooden barriers that can hold back tons of water. Except this log jam was moving. Not much, just slightly. Rising and falling, maybe 6 inches, in perfect rhythm with the breathing sound. The entire 40-foot-wide mass of logs and branches lifting up, then settling down. Up, down, up, down. I stood there frozen, my fly line trailing in the water, watching this impossible thing. Log jams don't move like that. They're stable, wedged in place by their own weight and the force of the current. They don't rise and fall like a chest breathing. I moved closer, stepping carefully across the slick rocks, trying to get a better angle to see what I was looking at. Maybe it was a trick of perspective. Maybe the failing light was creating an illusion. Maybe the logs shifted again, rising higher this time, and I saw underneath. It wasn't logs at the bottom. It was flesh. Gray-brown flesh, textured like tree bark, but definitely organic, definitely living tissue. The logs weren't piled on rocks. They were piled on something. Something that was using the logs as camouflage, as cover, lying in the creek with tons of downed timber weighing it down. My scientific training went to war with my survival instinct. The scientist in me was fascinated. This was impossible. There was no animal in the Appalachians large enough to lie across a 40-foot creek and strong enough to lift that much weight. The terrified human in me was screaming to run. I stood there paralyzed as the logjam lifted again, higher this time, and more of the thing beneath became visible. I could see the texture of its skin, rough, ridged, covered in moss and algae like it had been lying in this creek for years. I could see what might have been legs or appendages extending downstream submerged under the water, and I could see what I thought was an eye. It was massive, maybe 8 feet across, positioned about 20 feet from where I stood. Yellow-brown, with a horizontal pupil like a goat's, and it was looking at me. Not at the creek, not at the sky, directly at me. The breathing changed, got faster, deeper. The logjam began rising and falling more rapidly, and I heard a new sound underneath the breathing, a low rumble, almost subsonic, that made my chest vibrate. That's when my survival instinct won. I dropped my fly rod and ran, not carefully, not quietly, just pure panicked flight back downstream toward my camp, splashing through the shallows, slipping on rocks, not caring about the noise I was making. Behind me, I could hear the rumbling getting louder, and then a massive splash, as if something huge had just entered the water. I didn't look back. I crashed through the riverside vegetation, branches whipping my face, my breath coming in gasps that matched the rhythm of that terrible breathing I'd heard. My camp was a quarter-mile away. Every piece of equipment I owned was there, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever was in that creek. The splashing behind me continued, getting closer. Not the sound of something swimming, something walking. Heavy footfalls in the water, each step sending up huge splashes, something massive moving through the creek with purposeful speed. I reached my camp and didn't slow down. My tent, my research equipment, my vehicle keys, all of it abandoned. I just kept running, following the rough fisherman's trail that paralleled the creek, my headlamp bouncing wildly as I ran through the gathering darkness. The trail climbed away from the creek, switchbacking up the valley wall. I took the slope as fast as my legs would move, lungs burning, muscles screaming, but driven by pure terror. Behind and below me, I could still hear it in the water. Still moving. Still following. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been 20 minutes. Could have been an hour. Eventually, the trail leveled out on the ridgetop, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, my legs shaking so badly I couldn't stand. That's when I realized the splashing had stopped. Everything had stopped. No creek noise, no bird calls, no wind. Just absolute silence pressing in from the darkness around me. I turned on my headlamp, sweeping the beam through the trees. Nothing. Just forest. I was high enough up the ridge that I could see back down into the valley, see the line where Big Laurel Creek cut through. The water looked normal from up here. Just a creek, reflecting the last traces of twilight. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, the breathing, the movement, that eye watching me from beneath the log jam. I spent that night on the ridge, sitting with my back against a tree, my headlamp running until the battery died, listening to the darkness. When dawn finally came, I worked up the courage to go back down. Not all the way to the creek, just close enough to see my campsite from above. Everything was there. My tent still standing, my equipment exactly where I'd left it. No sign of disturbance, no tracks, nothing to indicate anything large had come through the area. From this distance, Big Laurel Creek looked like any other mountain stream, peaceful and beautiful in the morning light. I didn't go down to pack up my gear. I hiked 3 miles to the nearest road and hitched a ride to my truck at the trailhead. 2 days later, I came back with my colleague Cassidy and a park ranger to retrieve my equipment. "You said you saw something in the creek," Cassidy asked as we hiked in. She was trying to be supportive, but I could hear the skepticism. "Something large," I said. "Under the log jam at the fishing hole." When we reached the spot, the log jam was gone. Completely gone. Just open water where 40 feet of tangled timber had been wedged 2 days earlier. "Floods move log jams all the time," the ranger said. "We haven't had rain, but sometimes they just release on their own. The current eventually works them loose. But there hadn't been enough current to move that much wood, and log jams don't carry themselves downstream. They break apart, leaving debris scattered for miles. This had simply vanished." We packed up my camp in silence. Cassidy kept giving me concerned looks but didn't say anything. On the hike out, we passed the pool where I'd been fishing. Deep, cold, crystal clear. You could see all the way to the bottom. Just rocks and gravel, and a few trout hovering in the current. Back at the office, I filed a report describing the incident in the most clinical terms I could manage. Observed unusual acoustic phenomena and possible large fauna in Big Laurel Creek drainage. Recommend further investigation. It went into a file somewhere, and nothing came of it. But I started doing research. I went through old forestry records, TVA archives, historical accounts from the area, searching for any mention of something large in Big Laurel Creek, any unexplained incidents, any local legends about the drainage. I found a surveyor's note from 1892. Creek course in Big Laurel Valley appears altered from previous mapping. Possible landslide or flood event. Local guides refuse to enter area, claim creek is occupied. A logging company report from 1923. Crew abandoned timber operation in Big Laurel drainage after several workers reported breathing sounds from creek. Recommend avoiding area. And a handwritten entry in a forest ranger's log from 1967. Fishermen reported seeing something large submerged in Big Laurel Creek. Investigation found no evidence. Concluded witness had been drinking. Area has history of similar reports. Similar reports. History. Whatever I'd encountered that evening, I wasn't the first. I reached out to my friend Keeley, a wildlife biologist who specializes in cryptozoology, the study of animals that might exist but haven't been scientifically documented. I didn't tell her what I'd seen, just asked if she'd heard of anything unusual in the Big Laurel Creek area. Big Laurel, she said. Yeah, there's stories. Old Cherokee legends about something they called the creek dragon, a massive creature that lived in water, could hold its breath for days, would lie motionless under debris waiting for prey. They said it was ancient, that it had been there since before humans came to these mountains. You think there's any truth to it? I asked. I think these mountains are old, Keeley said carefully, and they're still largely unexplored. There are thousands of unmapped hollows, unnamed creeks, places where no scientist has ever set foot. Could something large survive undetected in an environment like that? She paused. Maybe. Especially if it's aquatic or semi-aquatic. Water's a good place to hide. How large are we talking? I asked. Based on the legends, large enough to dam a creek. Large enough that a person standing next to it might think they were looking at a log jam. Large enough to breathe with a sound you could hear across a valley. Large enough to have an eye 8 feet across. I haven't been back to Big Laurel Creek. My research there is officially incomplete. I have 3 days of good data and nothing from the 4th day. My boss wanted me to return to finish the sampling, but I requested a different watershed. He was annoyed but approved it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, lying in that pool under a new accumulation of logs, breathing slow and deep, waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. Prey? Solitude? For people to forget it exists so it can continue its ancient, patient existence undetected. I tell myself it was a hallucination, exhaustion, low blood sugar, oxygen deprivation from the altitude. My mind creating something impossible because I'd been alone in the wilderness too long. That's the rational explanation, the one that lets me sleep at night. But I remember the feeling of the air pressure changing with each breath. I remember that eye, intelligent and aware, tracking my movement. I remember the sound of it walking through the water, pursuing me with unhurried certainty. And I know that Big Laurel Creek, like thousands of other remote waterways in these mountains, remains largely unsurveyed, unstudied, unknown. We assume we know what lives in these forests, what inhabits these streams. We assume our biological catalogs are complete, that if something large existed, we'd have found it by now. But the Appalachians are ancient. They were mountains when the Himalayas were still seafloor. They've been eroding, hiding valleys, creating labyrinths of hollows and creeks and caverns for hundreds of millions of years. They've had plenty of time to keep secrets. If you're doing field work in remote watersheds, pay attention to sounds that don't make sense. If a log jam looks too regular, too organized, if the timber seems to be moving even slightly, leave. Don't investigate. Don't try to get closer. Just leave. Because some things in these mountains have learned to hide in plain sight. They've learned to look like natural features, to mimic the landscape, to remain motionless for days or weeks or longer, breathing slowly under cover, waiting for the curious to come close enough. And if you hear a creek that breathes, if you see logs that rise and fall like lungs, if you catch a glimpse of something massive beneath the debris, run. Don't pack up your camp. Don't try to document it. Don't think your scientific credentials will protect you. Just run and hope it doesn't decide to follow. Think about sharing a shelter with someone who copies your every movement but isn't actually human. I learned on the Appalachian Trail that some companions don't need to speak to tell you they're not what they appear to be. They just need to mirror you perfectly, right down to your breathing, until you realize you're alone with something wearing the shape of a person. My name is Harley, and I've been through hiking the Appalachian Trail solo, a 2,090-mile journey from Georgia to Maine that I started in early March 2024. By late May, I was in the Nantahala National Forest of North Carolina, averaging about 15 miles a day, feeling strong and confident in my routine. Solo through hiking isn't unusual. Plenty of people do it. And there's an understanding among trail hikers that everyone respects each other's space, while still maintaining that loose community feeling that makes the AT special. On May 23rd, I was heading toward a three-sided shelter about 12 miles into my day's hike. These shelters are scattered along the AT, simple wooden structures with 3 walls, a roof, and an open front, designed to sleep 6 to 8 hikers on raised wooden platforms. They're first come, first served, and there's an unwritten etiquette. You share the space, you're quiet after dark, you respect other people's gear and personal space. I reached the shelter around 6:30 p.m., just as the light was starting to fade. The structure sat in a small clearing maybe 30 yards off the main trail, surrounded by dense hardwood forest. A single picnic table stood in front, and there was a bear cable strung between 2 trees for hanging food bags. Someone was already there. I could see a sleeping bag laid out on the far left side of the platform, a dark green mummy bag positioned in the corner. A small stuff sack sat next to it, and a pair of hiking boots, looked like Salomon's popular trail shoes, were lined up neatly at the edge of the platform. "Hello," I called out as I approached. Trail courtesy. You announce yourself. Let people know you're coming. "Anyone home?" No response. The sleeping bag was zipped up all the way, and I couldn't see if anyone was inside it. Maybe they'd gone to get water from the nearby stream, or they were off doing their business. I shrugged and started setting up my own space on the opposite side of the shelter, as far from the occupied bag as possible. I laid out my sleeping pad and bag, organized my gear, then headed to the stream to filter water. The whole process took maybe 20 minutes. When I got back, the green sleeping bag still hadn't moved, and I still hadn't seen or heard the other hiker. Starting to feel a little weird about it, I called out again. "Hey, just want to let you know I'm camping here too. Hope that's okay." Nothing. The shelter remained silent except for the evening sounds of the forest, birds settling in for the night, the breeze moving through leaves, the distant sound of the stream. I made dinner on my camp stove at the picnic table, ate my rehydrated meal while watching the last of the daylight fade. The whole time, the sleeping bag didn't move. Not a shift, not a rustle. It was too still. Even if someone was sleeping deeply, you'd see some movement. Breathing, at least. This looked like an empty bag, but the boots and stuff sack suggested otherwise. By 8:30 p.m. it was fully dark, and I was exhausted from the day's miles. I brushed my teeth, hung my food bag on the bear cable, and climbed into my sleeping bag on my side of the shelter. My headlamp illuminated the wooden platform, and I could see across to the green bag, still completely motionless. Maybe they died, I thought, then immediately felt bad for thinking it. But what if? What if whoever was in that bag had a medical emergency and I was just assuming they were asleep? I should check. That's what any decent human would do. "Hey," I said loudly. "Are you okay over there? I'm getting worried. If you don't answer, I'm going to come check on you." The sleeping bag didn't move, but as I was about to get up, I heard it. A long, slow exhalation, like someone breathing out after holding their breath. Then nothing. "Hello?" I tried again. "Can you hear me?" Another breath. In this time, deep and deliberate. Then out again. Then nothing for maybe 30 seconds. Then another breath cycle. Relief flooded through me. They were alive, just sleeping heavily. Or maybe they were one of those hikers who didn't like small talk, who preferred to be left alone. Fair enough. I turned off my headlamp and settled into my bag. That's when I noticed the timing. I was lying on my side, my own breathing naturally deep and steady after a long day of hiking, and the breathing from the green bag was matching mine. Perfectly. When I inhaled a few seconds later, I'd hear that long inhalation from across the shelter. When I exhaled, the same delayed exhalation would follow. Coincidence, I told myself. Relaxed people breathe at similar rates. Nothing weird about that. I shifted position, rolling onto my back. 30 seconds later, I heard rustling from the green bag, the sound of someone rolling onto their back, the same amount of movement, the same duration of rustling. My skin prickled. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd been alone on the trail too long and was reading meaning into random coincidences. I deliberately changed position again, rolling to my right side and adjusting my sleeping pad. Counted in my head, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, rustle. The green bag shifted, the same movement pattern, the same sounds, delayed by about 5 seconds. My heart started pounding. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was copying me, intentionally mimicking my movements. But why? Was it some kind of weird joke? Trail hazing for solo female hikers? "Why are you doing that?" I called out into the darkness. My voice sounded thin and scared. "Why are you copying me?" No verbal response. But the breathing continued, still matching mine. And now I couldn't unhear it. Every breath I took, every exhale was echoed from that corner of the shelter after a 5-second delay. I turned on my headlamp, shining it across the shelter toward the green bag. In the harsh LED light, I could see it clearly. The bag was moving, rising and falling with breaths. And now that I was watching, I saw it shift slightly. The same motion I'd just made, adjusting my sleeping bag, replayed like a recording. "Stop it," I said, my voice shaking. "Please just stop. This isn't funny." The breathing continued. The mimicry continued. And now, in the light of my headlamp, I could see something that made my blood run cold. The boots at the edge of the platform, the Salomons I'd assumed belonged to whoever was in the bag, were the same model as mine. The same color, the same wear pattern on the soles, the same mud stains on the sides. I looked down at my own boots, sitting at the edge of my platform. Then back at those boots, identical. My stuff sack, the blue one I used for extra clothes. I had one just like it. And there, next to the green sleeping bag, was an identical blue stuff sack. In fact, everything next to that sleeping bag was identical to my gear. The water bottle, the trekking poles leaning against the shelter post, the journal I used to log my daily miles. All of it. Perfect copies. "What are you?" I whispered. The breathing stopped. Complete silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then, from inside the green sleeping bag, in a voice that sounded exactly like my own voice, I heard, "What are you?" I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, shaking, my headlamp beam jerking wildly. The green bag was moving now, the zipper being pulled down from the inside. Slowly, deliberately, and I knew with absolute certainty that I didn't want to see what was about to emerge. I grabbed my boots, my real boots, and my phone, not bothering with anything else. Not my sleeping bag, not my pack, not my carefully organized gear. I just ran, in socks, down from the shelter platform, across the clearing, stumbling toward where I thought the trail was. Behind me, I heard footsteps on the wooden platform, the sound of someone, something, climbing out of that sleeping bag and walking across the shelter floor. The footsteps sounded exactly like mine. The same weight, the same gait, the same rhythm. I found the trail by feel and started running north, using my headlamp to pick out the white blazes that marked the AT. My feet were screaming, running in socks over roots and rocks. But terror overrode pain. I just needed distance, needed to get away from whatever that was in the shelter. I ran for maybe 20 minutes before exhaustion forced me to stop. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps on the trail behind me, not running, walking. That same, deliberate pace I'd heard on the shelter platform. I turned off my headlamp and stood absolutely still in the darkness, trying to quiet my breathing, trying to become invisible. The footsteps continued, getting closer, and with them, I heard breathing. My breathing. The exact pattern, the exact depth, like a recording playing back. It walked past me in the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, could sense it moving on the trail maybe 10 feet away. the same height as me, the same footfalls, and it was making a sound under its breath, counting steps in my voice. 1001, 1002, 1003. That's how I counted when I was hiking, to track miles, to pass time on boring trail sections. 1001, 1002. I'd been counting earlier that day, and somehow this thing had heard me and learned it. The footsteps continued past and faded into the distance ahead of me. It was still walking north, still following the trail. I waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. Then I turned and started walking south. Back the way I'd come, away from the shelter, away from that thing. I hiked through the night, my feet bleeding, my body shaking with adrenaline and cold. By dawn, I'd covered maybe 8 miles and reached a road crossing where I hitched a ride to the nearest town. The driver was concerned about my condition. No pack, no proper shoes, bleeding feet, eyes wild with fear. I told him I'd been attacked and needed to get to the police. At the station, I filed a report about someone harassing me at the shelter. I didn't mention the perfect mimicry, the identical gear, the voice that sounded like mine. I just said another hiker had scared me and I'd fled. 2 days later, my friend Liberty drove out from Virginia to bring me home. Before we left, I convinced her to drive me back to the trail so I could retrieve my gear from the shelter. I needed my pack, my sleeping bag, my phone charger, hundreds of dollars of equipment I couldn't afford to replace. We hiked in together in the middle of the day, armed with pepper spray and a healthy dose of skepticism from Liberty, who thought I'd either been pranked by another hiker or had experienced some kind of breakdown from trail fatigue. The shelter was empty, completely empty. No green sleeping bag, no boots, no stuff sack, and no sign of my gear either. My sleeping bag was gone. My pack, my sleeping pad, my water bottles, all of it had vanished. The only thing remaining was my trekking poles, leaning against the shelter post exactly where I'd left them. "Are you sure this is the right shelter?" Liberty asked, looking around the empty platform. I was sure. I recognized the specific pattern of wood grain on the platform, the position of the bear cable, the view across the clearing. This was the place. But it was like I'd never been there, like the other hiker. The thing in the green bag and I had both been erased. We filed a police report about stolen gear, but nothing came of it. The AT community couldn't explain it either. Gear theft does happen on the trail, but taking literally everything except a pair of trekking poles. It didn't make sense. I tried to research it. Found some old forum posts from thru hikers mentioning strange encounters in shelters, companions who don't speak, who mirror movements, who seem off in ways that are hard to articulate. One hiker in 2019 wrote, "Stayed in a shelter in NC. Other person in bag wouldn't respond but copied everything I did. Felt wrong. Left at night. Never went back." Another from 2015. "Something in the shelter at mile marker 107. Looked human. Breathed like human. But wrong. All wrong. Don't stay there alone." And a note from a trail maintainer in 2021. Received multiple reports of mimic hiker in the Nantahala section. Hikers describe identical gear, identical movements, no verbal response. Recommend buddy system for this section. I never finished my through hike. The AT was supposed to be my journey of self-discovery, my physical and mental challenge, my big adventure. But after that night, I couldn't go back. The thought of sleeping in another shelter, of waking up to find something sharing the space with me, something wearing the shape of a hiker but mimicking rather than being, I just couldn't do it. My friend Darcy, who through hiked successfully in 2023, tells me I should try again, that whatever I experienced was a one-time thing, an anomaly, that the trail is safe, the shelters are safe, I just got unlucky. But I remember that voice, my voice coming from inside that sleeping bag, asking, "What are you?" Like it genuinely wanted to know, like it was studying me, learning me, trying to figure out what makes a person so it could become a better copy. And I remembered the counting, 1001, 1002, something that learned my habits from listening, that absorbed my patterns and played them back. Not a person. Not quite. Something else wearing the behavior of a person like a costume. If you hike the AT, especially the Nantahala section of North Carolina, be careful about shelters. If you arrive and find someone already there who won't respond to greetings, who's completely motionless in their sleeping bag, leave. Don't stay the night. Don't try to be polite or follow trail etiquette. And if you do stay, and you notice your shelter companion starting to mirror your movements, copying your breathing, echoing your sounds, get out. Immediately. Don't wait to see what emerges from that sleeping bag. Don't wait to hear your own voice coming from something that isn't you, because some things in these mountains have learned to mimic, to copy, to become what they observe. And the longer you stay near them, the better their imitation gets. Until maybe, just maybe, they don't need you anymore. They've learned everything about you. They've become you. And then what happens to the original? I don't know, and I never want to find out. How certain are you that a mountain you climbed before will be the same mountain tomorrow? I hiked Max Patch 5 times in 2 years, memorized every landmark, every turn, until the day I reached a summit that couldn't exist, with views I'd never seen and a reality that refused to match my memory. My name is Amira, and I'm a landscape architect from Asheville, North Carolina. Part of my work involves hiking to high-elevation sites to document native plant communities and assess viewsheds for conservation planning. Max Patch is one of my favorite locations, a 4,729-foot grassy bald on the Tennessee-North Carolina border, accessible via a moderate 1.1-mile trail from the parking area. It's a popular spot, known for its 360-degree views and distinctive treeless summit that feels more like Scotland than southern Appalachia. I'd climbed Max Patch 5 times between 2022 and 2024. Same trail, same summit, same spectacular views. I knew that mountain intimately, the way the trail switchbacks through the forest before breaking out onto the grassy slopes, the rock outcrop halfway up where people stop to rest, the exact spot on the summit where you get the best view of Mount Guyot to the north. On September 28, 2024, I returned for what should have been a routine documentation hike. I needed updated photos of the plant communities for a grant proposal, and the forecast promised perfect conditions. Clear skies, low humidity, temperatures in the mid-60s. I arrived at the trailhead parking area around 8 a.m. to find it nearly empty, just 2 other vehicles. Perfect for photography work when you want minimal foot traffic disturbing the vegetation. I started up the trail with my camera gear, field notebook, and GPS unit. The first quarter mile was exactly as I remembered. Mixed hardwood forest with a dense understory of blackberry and rhododendron, the trail climbing steadily through switchbacks that gained elevation at a comfortable pace. I passed the rock outcrop at the half-mile mark, noted the distinctive lightning-scarred oak tree that marked the 3/4 point, and emerged onto the grassy slopes just as the morning sun cleared the eastern ridges. Everything was correct. Everything matched my memory and my previous documentation. The trail, the landmarks, the vegetation, all exactly as it should be. But when I reached the summit, everything was wrong. The shape was wrong. Max Patch has a distinctive oval summit, maybe 200 yards long and 100 yards wide, with the highest point slightly off-center to the east. What I was standing on was circular, much larger, and completely flat across the top, maybe 400 yards in diameter, with no variation in elevation. The views were wrong. From Max Patch, you should see Mount Guyot and the Great Smoky Mountains to the north, the Black Mountains and Mount Mitchell to the northeast, the Bald Mountains to the south. What I was looking at made no sense. The ridgelines were oriented in the wrong directions. Mountains that should be north were south. Peaks I recognized were in the wrong positions relative to each other, like someone had rearranged the entire landscape. Even the vegetation was wrong. Max Patch's summit is maintained as a grassy bald, dominated by native grasses with scattered forbs. But this summit, whatever summit I was actually on, had vegetation I'd never seen there. Wildflowers that don't grow at this elevation. Grass species that aren't native to the region. And in the center of the summit, a perfect ring of standing stones, maybe 30 feet in diameter, each stone roughly 3 feet tall, arranged with mathematical precision. I stood there, frozen, my brain trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what should be there. This wasn't Mac's Patch. But I'd hiked the correct trail. I'd passed all the right landmarks. My GPS said I was at 4,729 feet elevation at the exact coordinates for Mac's Patch summit. I pulled out my phone to check the downloaded topographic map. According to the map, I was standing exactly where Mac's Patch should be. But looking around, nothing matched. I was on a mountain that shouldn't exist, with views of peaks that shouldn't be visible from this location, standing next to a stone circle that had never been documented in any survey of this area. My hands were shaking as I raised my camera and started taking photos. Professional training overrode confusion. Document first, analyze later. I photographed the stone circle from multiple angles, shot panoramic views of the surrounding peaks, took detailed images of the unknown vegetation. Through my viewfinder, I noticed something else strange. There were other hikers on the summit, at least a dozen of them, scattered across the grassy expanse, but none of them were moving. They were just standing there, completely still, facing different directions like they were admiring the views, but no one was taking photos. No one was talking. No one was moving at all. I lowered my camera and looked at them directly. They were dressed as hikers, backpacks, boots, hiking clothes. But something was off about them in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Their clothing looked wrong, slightly too formal, slightly too old-fashioned, styles from different decades all mixed together. And they were all standing in poses that were too perfect, too symmetrical, like statues arranged for aesthetic effect. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded strange, muffled, like the air was swallowing the sound. "Excuse me, can anyone tell me if this is Mac's Patch?" None of them responded. None of them moved. They just stood there, perfect, and still, and wrong, like mannequins someone had placed around the summit. I started walking toward the nearest one, a man in his 50s, wearing a red fleece jacket and khaki pants. He was facing northeast, looking toward mountains I couldn't identify. As I got closer, I could see more details that made my skin crawl. His expression was fixed, unchanging. His eyes open but not blinking. His chest wasn't moving, no breathing. And his hands, visible in front of him, holding what looked like binoculars, were positioned too precisely, fingers at exact angles like they'd been carefully arranged. I reached out slowly and touched his arm. His jacket was real fabric, and underneath I could feel what seemed like solid flesh. But it was cold. Not corpse cold, just the ambient temperature of the mountain air, like he'd been standing there long enough to equalize with his environment. That's when he turned his head. Not his body, just his head, rotating smoothly toward me with a movement that was too fluid, too continuous, like there were no bones or joints limiting the motion. His eyes focused on me, and his mouth opened. "You're not supposed to see this," he said, in a voice that sounded like a recording played back. Flat, emotionless, not quite human. "You took the wrong turn. You walked the wrong path. You ended up in the wrong version." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. All around the summit, the other figures were turning now, all of them rotating toward me with that same too smooth motion. A dozen pairs of eyes fixed on me. A dozen mouths opening. "Go back," they said in unison. That same flat recorded voice coming from all of them. "Walk the trail again. Count your steps. 1,273 steps from the parking lot to the true summit. You're at 1,290. You walked 17 steps too far." "What is this place?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What are you?" "We are the ones who took too many steps," the figures said together. "We are the ones who walked a little too far, turned at the wrong moment, ended up in the space between mountains. We can't leave. The path only works one way. If you walk it correctly, you reach the summit you expect. If you walk it wrong, even slightly wrong, you end up here, with us, forever. One of them, a young woman in an old-fashioned hiking dress from maybe the 1950s, stepped forward. Her movement was jerky now, not smooth, like her control was stuttering. "Leave now," she said, her voice cracking. "While you still can, before the mountain decides you belong here. Before you become like us, another landmark for this summit that shouldn't exist, standing forever as a warning no one will see." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran toward where I'd come up, back toward the trail that had brought me here. But when I reached the edge of the grassy summit where the trail should enter the woods, there was no trail, just unbroken forest, dense and impenetrable, with no sign of a path. Behind me, I could hear footsteps. The figures were walking toward me, all of them moving now, their movements becoming more natural, more human. "You stayed too long," they called out. "The mountain is accepting you. Soon you'll stop. Soon you'll stand. Soon you'll join us in marking this false summit forever." My legs felt heavy, not tired, heavy, like they were becoming rooted, like whatever held these figures in their perfect poses was starting to affect me. I fought against it, forcing myself to keep moving, to walk the perimeter of the summit looking for any sign of the trail down. That's when I saw it. Not the trail I'd come up, but a different trail, barely visible, cutting down the northwest slope. I had no idea where it led, but it was a way off the summit, and that was all that mattered. I staggered toward it, my legs growing heavier with each step, and plunged into the forest. The trail descended steeply, switchbacking through dense forest. Nothing looked familiar. The trees were wrong, the understory was wrong, even the smell of the forest was different. But I kept moving, half running, half falling down the mountainside, desperate to put distance between myself and that impossible summit. I don't know how long I descended. My watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 8:47, which made no sense because I'd reached the summit well after 9 Surg. But I kept going, following the trail even though I had no idea where it led, driven by the terrifying certainty that stopping meant joining those figures on the summit, standing frozen forever in a place that shouldn't exist. Finally, the trail leveled out, and I burst out of the forest into a parking area. But it wasn't the Max Patch parking area. It was completely different, larger, paved, with a wooden information kiosk and bathrooms. The sign on the kiosk read Max Patch Trail, but listed different mileage than I knew was correct. 2.3 miles to summit instead of 1.1. My truck wasn't there. The parking area had maybe a dozen vehicles, none of which I recognized. And when I looked at the license plates, none of them were from states that made sense. Tennessee and North Carolina plates, yes, but also plates from states that don't exist. Appalachia, in flowing script. Cumberland, with an unfamiliar state seal. A family was loading gear into their car, parents and 2 kids, looking normal and solid and real in a way the figures on the summit hadn't been. I approached them cautiously. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hoarse. "Is this the Max Patch trailhead?" The father looked at me strangely. "Yes, ma'am. Max Patch Mountain. Are you all right? You look like you've had a rough hike." "I think I got turned around," I said carefully. What county are we in?" "Madison County, North Carolina," he said, still looking concerned. "Same as it's always been. You need water? You want us to call someone?" "Madison County." That was correct, but nothing else was. I thanked him and walked to the edge of the parking area, looking back toward where the trail entered the forest. According to the information board, Max Patch was 2.3 miles away via a moderate trail with an elevation gain of 1,400 feet. But that was wrong. Max Patch should be 1.1 miles, 800 feet of elevation gain. Everyone who hikes here knows that. I pulled out my phone, finally getting a signal, and did a search for Max Patch. The information I found matched what the sign said, 2.3 miles, 1,400 feet gain. Articles, trail guides, Park Service websites, all of them listing the distances I knew were wrong, but that everyone here seemed to think were correct. I spent the rest of that day trying to get back to my truck, which according to my GPS was at a parking area that didn't exist anymore, or maybe had never existed in this version of reality. Eventually, my friend Dior drove from Asheville to pick me up. She didn't understand why I was at the wrong trailhead, or why I kept insisting Max Patch was supposed to be a different distance. "It's always been 2.3 miles, she said as we drove. "I've hiked it a dozen times. You feeling okay? You seem really disoriented." I didn't tell her about the summit that was too large, about the stone circle, about the figures standing frozen, who said they'd taken too many steps. I just let her think I'd gotten confused, maybe had a bit of heat exhaustion or altitude sickness. But I know what happened. Somehow, I walked 17 extra steps on that trail and ended up on a version of Max Patch that exists in some other configuration of reality. A place where hikers who miscounted their steps or turned at the wrong microsecond get trapped, standing forever as warnings on an impossible summit. I checked my camera's memory card when I got home. I'd taken dozens of photos on that summit, the stone circle, the wrong vegetation, the misaligned mountains, even some shots of the frozen figures. But every single image was corrupted, not deleted, not blank, corrupted in ways that made no sense. Pixels arranged in patterns that looked almost intentional, almost like warnings, encoding information I couldn't decode. My friend Lisa, who works in digital forensics, analyzed the files for me. "This is weird," she said. "The corruption patterns aren't random. They're too organized. It's like something overwrote your photos with, I don't know, data that cameras aren't designed to capture, wavelengths outside visible light maybe, or information from a different dimensional axis." She was joking, but I wasn't laughing. I haven't been back to Max Patch. I'm too afraid that I'll count wrong again, that 17 extra steps, or 17 fewer steps, or some other wrong number, will take me back to that summit where time stops, and hikers become permanent fixtures on a mountain that exists between realities. But sometimes I wonder about those figures. How long have they been standing there? Some of their clothes looked old, styles from the 1950s, 1970s, 1990s. Decades of hikers, all of whom miscounted by a few steps, ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time and got trapped there forever. And I wonder, how many versions of Max Patch are there? How many slightly wrong summits exist in the spaces between the steps we count, waiting for hikers who lose track of their pace to stumble into them? And on each of those summits are there frozen figures standing guard, trying to warn others while slowly becoming permanent parts of the landscape. If you hike in the Appalachians, count your steps. I know it sounds paranoid, but count them. Know exactly how many steps it takes to reach the summit. And if you ever reach a mountaintop that doesn't quite match your memory, if the shape is wrong, if the views don't align, if you see people standing too still, leave immediately. Don't try to understand it. Don't stop to take photos. Don't talk to the figures, even if they speak to you. Just go. Find any trail down that you can and take it, even if it leads somewhere you don't recognize. Because in these ancient mountains, in these eroded folds that have been worn down over hundreds of millions of years, there are spaces between spaces, versions of peaks that exist alongside the ones we think we know. And sometimes, if you walk just slightly wrong, if you take 17 steps too many or too few, you'll end up in one of those in-between places, and you might never find your way back to the mountain you meant to climb. Could you refuse if a place demanded you leave behind something you treasure, knowing a refusal might mean you never leave at all? I found a waterfall that shouldn't exist, photographed it, and learned that some beautiful things in these mountains aren't free. They exact a price, and you won't know what it is until it's too late to say no. My name is Malka, and I'm a nature photographer working freelance for outdoor magazines and conservation organizations. I spend most of my time chasing down rumored locations, hidden waterfalls, forgotten overlooks, places that exist more in whispered recommendations than on official maps. The thrill is in the discovery, in being the first photographer to properly document a location that's been hiding in plain sight. In July 2024, I was researching waterfalls in the remote sections of the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee. I'd heard rumors on a photography forum about something called Lost Creek Falls, a significant waterfall somewhere in a deep ravine that supposedly had never been properly photographed because of access difficulties. Several people claimed to have found it, but no one had posted coordinates, and the descriptions were maddeningly vague. "You have to just wander until you find it," one person wrote. "It's not on any map, but once you're close, you'll hear it." That kind of mystery is irresistible to someone in my profession. I compiled what little information existed, mentions in old hiking forums, a single reference in a 1970s forestry report, a notation on a hand-drawn map from 1954 that labeled an area Lost Kiar, with no additional detail. The consensus seemed to be that it was somewhere in the Bald River watershed, in one of the numerous unnamed ravines that cut through that rugged terrain. I spent 3 days searching. I hiked every official trail in the area, explored game trails and creek beds, bushwhacked through rhododendron thickets. I found several small waterfalls, pretty but nothing exceptional, nothing that matched the descriptions I'd read. By the afternoon of the third day, I was ready to give up, convinced Lost Creek Falls was either a hoax or so inaccessible that it wasn't worth the effort. That's when I heard it. Not a roar. Waterfalls don't roar unless they're massive. This was more of a continuous rush, muffled by distance and vegetation, but unmistakable once you knew what to listen for. I was maybe a quarter mile off any trail, standing in thick forest, where the ground sloped steeply toward what looked like a ravine. I followed the sound, picking my way carefully down the slope. The forest changed as I descended. The trees got larger, the undergrowth denser, and the air cooled noticeably. I was entering a microclimate, a pocket of environment that stayed perpetually shaded and moist, the kind of place that harbors species you don't find anywhere else. The ravine appeared suddenly, the ground just dropping away into a narrow gorge maybe, 200 feet deep, and at the far end, visible through the trees, was the waterfall, Lost Creek Falls. It was real. I stood there for a full minute just staring. It was spectacular, maybe 80 feet tall, the water dropping in a single straight plunge into a deep pool below. The ravine walls were covered in moss and ferns, and the mist from the waterfall created rainbows that shifted and danced in the filtered sunlight. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, and as far as I could tell, I was the first photographer to properly document it. Getting down to the pool took another 20 minutes of careful scrambling over wet rocks and through dense vegetation. When I finally reached the base of the falls, I was soaked from spray and scratched from rhododendron branches, but it was worth it. The pool was crystal clear, maybe 30 feet across, fed by the waterfall and drained by Lost Creek as it continued downstream through the ravine. I spent an hour photographing from every angle, wide shots capturing the full height, detail shots of the water hitting the pool, long exposures that turned the falling water into silk, tight crops of the moss-covered rocks. The light was perfect, the mist adding an ethereal quality to every image. These were going to be portfolio pieces, maybe even award-winning shots. That's when the feeling started. An overwhelming compulsion, a need so strong it felt physical. I had to leave something behind, something important, something personal. At first, I tried to ignore it. Just the adrenaline wearing off, I told myself. The exhaustion catching up after days of difficult hiking. But the feeling grew stronger, more insistent, until it was all I could think about. Leave something. You have to leave something. This place demands it. My hands were shaking as I looked through my gear, trying to understand what was happening to me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't exhaustion or dehydration or altitude sickness. This was something else, something coming from outside me, pressing into my mind with increasing urgency. I tried to leave without leaving anything, picked up my pack, started climbing back up toward the rim of the ravine. I made it maybe 50 feet before I had to stop. My chest felt tight, my breathing labored like I was at high altitude, even though I was only at 2,000 feet. My vision started to blur at the edges, and a wave of nausea hit me so hard I nearly fell. I climbed back down to the pool and immediately felt better. The pressure eased, my breathing returned to normal, my vision cleared. But the compulsion remained, stronger now, more demanding. Leave something precious. You can't leave without leaving something behind. With shaking hands, I pulled out my grandfather's compass. He'd given it to me before he died, made me promise I'd carry it on every adventure, every exploration. It was a beautiful thing. Brass case, hand-engraved lid, needle that still pointed true. After 60 years, I'd used it to find my way through dozens of remote locations, trusted it more than any GPS. I didn't want to leave it. Every part of me screamed against it, but I couldn't fight the compulsion anymore. It wasn't just a feeling now, it was a command, absolute and irresistible. I walked to the edge of the pool, opened the compass one last time to see the needle swing to north, and set it carefully on a flat rock at the waterline. The moment I let go, the feeling vanished, just gone, like it had never been there. I could breathe normally. My head cleared. The overwhelming need disappeared completely, leaving me standing there, feeling violated and confused and angry. I hiked out of the ravine without looking back, my mind racing. What had just happened? Some kind of psychological break. Exposure to something toxic, gas seeping from the rocks, spores from fungus growing in the moist environment. But that didn't explain the precision of the compulsion. The way it had known exactly what I was trying to do when I tried to leave. The way it had stopped the moment I complied. Back at my truck, I collapsed in the driver's seat and just sat there for an hour, trying to make sense of the experience. Eventually, I did what any modern person would do. I searched online for information about Lost Creek Falls. I found a thread on a hiking forum from 2019. The original poster had written, "Finally found Lost Creek Falls. Incredible place. But fair warning, I had to leave my wedding ring there. Weirdest thing ever. Tried to leave without leaving anything and got physically sick. Soon as I left the ring, felt fine." Anyone else experience this? Replies confirmed similar experiences. A photographer in 2017 had left an expensive lens. A hiker in 2015 had left his father's watch. A woman in 2021 had left her grandmother's locket. Everyone described the same overwhelming compulsion, the same physical inability to leave without leaving something precious behind. One reply stood out. "There are places in these mountains that exact tribute. Old places, places that predate human presence here. The Cherokee knew about them, called them hungry valleys, or something like that. Places that take things, that demand offerings. Lost Creek Falls is one of them. You can't fight it. Either you leave something that matters to you, or you don't leave at all." I scrolled further and found mentions of other similar locations scattered through the Appalachians. A cave in West Virginia where visitors felt compelled to leave coins. A meadow in North Carolina where hikers reported leaving jewelry. A spring in Virginia where people threw in car keys, phones, anything of value, driven by a compulsion they couldn't resist. Most disturbing was a news article from 2012 about a hiker found dead near an unnamed waterfall in Tennessee. The coroner ruled it dehydration and exposure, but the article mentioned that the hikers... There are sounds in these mountains that shouldn't have a source. Voices that know your deepest griefs and use them against you. I followed my grandmother's voice into the woods thinking I could find her one last time, and I learned that some mountains don't just echo the past, they weaponize it. My name is Emanuela, and I'm a grief counselor working in the Smoky Mountain region. I spend my days helping people process loss, teaching them that grief is a natural response to absence. But nothing prepared me for the day I heard my grandmother's voice singing from the forest, a year after she died, calling me deeper into the woods with a song only she knew. I'd been hiking Panther Creek Trail on a Thursday afternoon in October 2024, the same week my grandmother would have celebrated her 95th birthday. The trail was one we'd hiked together dozens of times over the years, and I decided to go back to remember her, to reconnect with the place where we'd spent so many peaceful afternoons together. The morning was crisp, the light golden through the canopy, the kind of weather she'd always loved. I passed the familiar landmarks, the rock outcrop halfway up where we'd always stopped to rest, the creek crossing where she'd once slipped on a wet stone and laughed about her clumsiness, the moss-covered boulder that looked like a sleeping bear. Every location held a memory. Every step felt like walking through her life with her again. Around 2 p.m., I reached the remote section of the trail where few people venture, the area near an old abandoned homestead from the 1800s. The buildings had long since crumbled, but you could still see the foundation stones, the remains of what had once been someone's entire world. That's when I heard it. A voice, singing, soft but unmistakable, carrying through the forest with perfect clarity, despite having no visible source. The melody was familiar, amazing grace, but sung in a particular way, with specific patterns of intonation and phrasing, the way my grandmother had sung it every Sunday of her life at the small church in her hometown. My breath caught. I stood completely still, listening, my heart starting to pound. It couldn't be. I knew it couldn't be. But the voice was undeniably, impossibly hers. "Grandma," I called out, feeling foolish even as I said it. "Grandma, where are you?" The singing continued, never varying, never stopping, never acknowledging my call. It just kept repeating that same verse, the same melody, the same particular way of drawing out the word grace that she'd always done. Following it was inevitable. I left the main trail and started pushing through the undergrowth toward where the voice seemed to be coming from, deeper into the forest, away from any established path. Some part of my brain was screaming that this was wrong, that something was off. But the professional grief counselor in me recognized what was happening. I was in denial about her death, creating an auditory hallucination as a way to process my grief. The rational explanation didn't stop me from following. The forest grew denser as I bushwhacked deeper, rhododendron thickets becoming denser, the canopy overhead blocking more light. The voice remained constant, always seeming to be just ahead, just around the next stand of trees, just beyond the next ridge. I followed it for what felt like hours, my legs getting scratched by branches, my pack catching on thorns, but I kept moving forward. Then I found the clearing, and in the center of that clearing was the old homestead, or what remained of it. Just foundation stones arranged in a rough rectangle, with a chimney still standing on one end, and scattered around the foundation, arranged in careful patterns, were wildflowers. Fresh wildflowers, mountain laurel, rhododendron blooms, purple trilliums, all arranged as if someone had placed them there with deliberate intention.
The singing stopped the moment I entered the clearing. The silence that followed was absolute, not just the absence of her voice, but the absence of all forest sounds. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just me and the ancient stones and the flowers arranged in patterns I couldn't quite interpret. I approached the foundation slowly, my hands shaking. This place had been hidden for over 150 years. No one maintained it. No one visited it. And yet, here were fresh flowers, arranged with care and intention. That's when I saw the handprint. On one of the chimney stones, pressed into dust that covered the surface, was a small handprint. Not an adult's hand, a child's hand, maybe 8 or 9 years old, fingers spread, pressed deliberately into the dust, and below it, scratched into the stone surface in what looked like fresh marks, was writing. I moved closer, my vision blurring, and read the words scratched into the stone.
We're still here. We never left. Tell them we never left. Every hair on my body stood on end. These were the exact words from the story my grandmother had told me years ago. The story about a dozen children from a community that had been forced from their home when the national park was created. Children who refused to accept displacement, who kept returning to the only place they'd ever known. Children who eventually disappeared and whose bodies were never found. The singing started again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was a dozen voices, children's voices singing the same hymn my grandmother had sung, all of them perfectly in sync, all of them coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering, my breath coming in gasps. The voices were inside the clearing now, surrounding me, and I could see shapes. Not quite solid, not quite visible, but definitely there. Children in clothes from different decades, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with eyes that weren't quite focused on anything I could see. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Why are you showing me this?" "We want to be remembered," they sang together, their voices blending into something that was almost musical, but fundamentally wrong. "We want someone to know we were here. Your grandmother knew. She remembered us. She kept us alive in her stories. Now you have to keep us alive too." I turned and ran. I crashed out of that clearing, through the undergrowth, back toward the main trail, my pack bouncing on my shoulders, branches tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I could still hear the singing getting louder, following me. I burst out onto the main trail, gasping, and the singing stopped instantly. I was alone again. Just the normal forest sounds around me, just the dying afternoon light filtering through the canopy. Nothing wrong, nothing impossible, nothing that couldn't be explained as exhaustion, grief, altitude sickness. I hiked out quickly, my mind racing. By the time I reached my truck, I'd already constructed a narrative that made sense. I'd been emotionally vulnerable, grieving my grandmother, and my brain had created an experience that helped me process that grief. Completely explainable, completely rational. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The handprint, the writing, the flowers arranged in impossible patterns, the children who stood at the edge of the clearing watching me. I called my mother, my grandmother's daughter, and asked her about the story she'd been told as a child, about the children who disappeared. "How did you know about that?" my mother asked, her voice strange. "Your grandmother never told you that story, did she?" "She said she wanted to, but she was always afraid." "I found it written somewhere," I lied. "Tell me what you remember." My mother told me the story I'd already read on those ancient stones. Children from a displaced community, refusing to accept that their home had been taken from them, walking miles through the mountains to return to the school and church in the valley. Eventually disappearing, their fate unknown, their story becoming nothing more than folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of wilderness. "Your grandmother spent her whole life trying to keep their memory alive," my mother said. "She wrote about them. She told their story to anyone who would listen. She said it was important that people knew that they didn't just vanish without trace." After I hung up, I realized what had happened. My grandmother hadn't been calling me into the forest because she'd come back from the dead. She'd been calling me because she'd been keeping a promise she'd made decades ago, the promise to keep those children's memory alive. And before she died, she'd passed that responsibility to me. The next week, I published my grandmother's stories about those children, stories she'd collected over decades, stories from old records, and interviews with community members who'd known people whose families had been displaced. I published them under both our names, making sure the children's story was documented, making sure their existence was acknowledged. I haven't returned to Panther Creek since that day. I don't need to. I understand now what happened in that clearing. Not supernatural intervention, but something more subtle. My grief made me receptive to a story that needed to be told, opened me to receiving a message that had been waiting for someone willing to listen. Whether the voices were real or psychological, whether the children I saw at the edge of that clearing were ghosts or manifestations of my own mind seeking connection with those who'd been forgotten, it doesn't matter. What matters is that their story is now documented and preserved. If you're hiking in these mountains and you hear something that doesn't have an obvious source, a voice, a song, a sound that calls to something deep inside you, pay attention. Because sometimes these mountains don't haunt us to frighten us. Sometimes they sing to us because there's a story that needs to be told, a memory that needs to be preserved, a truth that refuses to be forgotten. Listen to what the mountains are trying to say. Honor the voices that emerge from the forest. And if you hear someone calling you deeper into the woods, ask yourself, is this danger or is this responsibility? Because the ancient places remember everything. They remember the people who live there, the stories that were forgotten, the truths that were erased. And sometimes, if you're open to it, they'll pass those memories to you. They'll ask you to be the one who remembers. They'll ask you to be the one who tells the story. And that's a responsibility that never truly ends.